There is a silence in human history. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of answers to questions we don't even know to ask anymore. Picture a researcher in a modern library, late at night, searching through digital archives for something specific. A reference, a fragment, a mention of a text that once existed. They find the citation, a Greek philosopher, referencing a book about the nature of light, describing observations that sound impossibly advanced for their time. The researcher follows the trail backward through centuries of scholarship. Each reference leads to an older one, each mention more detailed than the last, until finally the trail ends. Not because they've found the source, but because the source vanished 2,000 years ago. It burned, or rotted, or was deliberately destroyed. The researcher will never know what that text contained. No one will. This scene has repeated itself thousands of times across 2 millennia. Different researchers, different texts, same outcome. The silence where knowledge used to be. The Library of Alexandria wasn't just a building full of books. It was humanity's first attempt to capture everything knowable in one place. Every culture's wisdom, every discipline's discoveries, every question anyone had ever thought to ask, along with whatever answers had been found. When we say it was lost, we're not talking about a building burning. We're talking about surgical techniques that could have saved millions of lives, forgotten before anyone knew they existed. Philosophical frameworks that might have reshaped how civilizations treated each other. Technologies we can barely imagine because we don't have enough fragments left to reconstruct what was possible. The loss isn't dramatic in the way we usually understand tragedy. There was no single day when everything disappeared, no moment when humanity collectively gasped at what had been taken. The loss was slow, incremental. A scroll here, a manuscript there, whole sections of the collection scattered and abandoned as the institution declined across centuries. By the time people realized what had happened, there was nothing left to save. Just references, citations, fragments of fragments. What haunts us isn't just what we lost. It's that we don't know what we lost. We can't measure the absence because we never inventoried what was there. Imagine losing your memory but not knowing you've lost it, continuing through life unaware that entire sections of your past have been erased. That's humanity's relationship with Alexandria's library. We're missing pieces of ourselves we can't even identify. The question that should keep us awake isn't what burned. It's what we would know right now, what we would be capable of if nothing had burned at all. What if everything we think we know about the ancient world, about human capability, about the progression of civilization, is just a fragment, the broken edge of something vastly larger that we'll never see whole? Every ship that entered Alexandria's harbour was robbed, but what the city stole was far more precious than gold. Alexandria shouldn't have existed. Not where it was, not how it was, not on the scale it achieved. The coast of Egypt, where Alexander the Great chose to build his city, was inhospitable, a thin strip between the Mediterranean Sea and Lake Merotis, with no natural freshwater source, no existing infrastructure, no obvious strategic advantage beyond a decent harbour. But Alexander saw something no one else did. Or perhaps he simply decided that vision was enough, that human will could transform an impossible location into the centre of the world. He died before seeing his city truly come alive. That honour went to Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals, who claimed Egypt after Alexander's empire shattered. Ptolemy understood what his city needed to become. Not just a capital, but a destination. A place that would draw the world to itself through sheer magnetic force. Walk through Alexandria in its prime, say, around 200 years before the Common Era, and you'd struggle to believe you were in the ancient world. The harbour bustled with ships from impossible distances, Indian vessels carrying spices and silk, Celtic traders from the edges of the known world, African merchants with ivory and exotic animals, Greek philosophers, Roman diplomats, Jewish scholars, Egyptian priests maintaining traditions thousands of years old. They all converged here, in streets where dozens of languages mixed into a constant multilingual hum. The Pharos lighthouse dominated the harbour entrance, tall enough to be seen from nearly 30 miles away, its fire visible through the night, guiding ships toward the city that never stopped wanting more trade, more culture, more people, more knowledge. Especially knowledge. The city had developed a peculiar hunger. When ships docked after paying their fees, after customs inspection, they faced one more search. Officials boarded and demanded something unusual: books. Any manuscript, any scroll, any written document found aboard was confiscated. Not permanently, in the strictest sense. The city's scribes would copy the text with meticulous care, then return the copy to the ship's owner. The original stayed in Alexandria. This wasn't negotiable. Ships' captains complained to authorities who simply shrugged. This was the price of entering Alexandria's harbour. Your gold you could keep. Your knowledge belonged to the city. Imagine the audacity of that policy. A civilization so convinced of knowledge's value that it violated property rights to obtain it. A government that treated books as more vital to the state than tax revenue. Ship owners eventually learned to hide their most precious manuscripts, sneaking them past inspections, protecting their intellectual property from a city that saw all written knowledge as rightfully its own. What drove this hunger? What made Alexandria's rulers believe they could, should, possess everything humans had ever written down? The answer stood at the city's heart, visible from almost anywhere within the walls. A complex of buildings that represented something new in human history, something that would change what civilization meant. The Library of Alexandria wasn't destroyed because it was a building. It was destroyed because of what the building contained. Before Alexandria, knowledge moved slowly. A scholar in Athens might spend their entire life unaware of discoveries made in Babylon. A physician in Egypt could practice medicine without ever learning techniques developed in India. Information traveled at the speed of human feet, carried by individuals who often had no idea what they were carrying or why it mattered. Knowledge was fragmented, scattered, isolated in the minds and manuscripts of thousands of separated communities. The library changed that equation, not just by gathering scrolls, but by creating something that hadn't existed before, an institution dedicated to collecting, organizing, and preserving everything humans had figured out. The concept sounds obvious now. Of course, you'd want to gather knowledge centrally. But in the ancient world, this was revolutionary, dangerous, even. Knowledge was power, and power wasn't something you shared freely with potential rivals. The library wasn't a single structure, but a complex. The main building, the Mouseion, named for the muses connected to research rooms, copying chambers, living quarters for scholars, dining halls, gardens for contemplative walking, lecture spaces. A smaller daughter library operated from the Serapeum Temple across the city, serving as both backup and overflow space. Together, they held somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls, though the exact number is lost to history, along with everything else. To understand the scale, a modern university library might hold millions of books, but remember that ancient scrolls were inefficient storage. A single modern book could require multiple scrolls. Adjust for the time period, for the total amount of written knowledge that existed in the world, and Alexandria's collection was proportionally larger than almost anything we have today. The library didn't just preserve a portion of human knowledge, it attempted to preserve all of it. The position of chief librarian carried immense prestige. These weren't administrators in the modern sense. They were often the most learned individuals alive. Eratosthenes, who calculated Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy, served as chief librarian. Callimachus, who created the first comprehensive catalogue of the collection, organized knowledge in ways that influenced information science for millennia. Aristarchus, who proposed that Earth orbited the Sun centuries before Copernicus, studied here. The library wasn't passive storage. It was an active research institution, perhaps humanity's first true university. Scholars came from across the known world, drawn by access to texts available nowhere else. They didn't just read, they debated, experimented, challenged existing assumptions, built on each other's work. Knowledge accumulated and compounded in ways that had never been possible before. Everything that follows all the tragedy, all the loss, all the centuries of darkness, happened because this place existed, and then stopped existing, because someone, or several someones, decided that what these buildings contained was too dangerous to preserve. The ancient Greeks had a word for the knowledge we lost, ta mysterion, the mysteries. But the real mystery is how close we came to never losing them at all. Modern scholars occasionally discover something haunting. They'll be reading a surviving ancient text, maybe one of Galen's medical works, or a fragment of Aristotle's lectures, and encounter a casual reference to another book. Something that sounds impossibly advanced. Descriptions of optical instruments that might have been primitive telescopes. Surgical procedures involving anesthesia and sterile technique that weren't rediscovered until the 19th century. Mathematical solutions to problems that plagued European scholars for over 1,000 years. The ancient writer mentions these texts as if everyone knows them, as if they're common reference material, then moves on. And we're left with nothing but the reference. The book itself is gone. These ghosts haunt the margins of history. A physician in the 2nd century mentions a text on human anatomy that contained detailed illustrations of the circulatory system. We know it existed because he argues with its conclusions. We'll never see the illustrations. A mathematician references a proof that supposedly demonstrated principles of calculus. The reference survives. The proof doesn't. An engineer describes machines powered by steam, then mentions that the complete plans exist in another text, which everyone has read. No one alive has read it. No one ever will again. The library's destruction created a kind of dark age, not just a period of time, but a darkness in what humanity knows about itself. We talk about the Middle Ages as if they were inevitably dark, as if human progress naturally pauses for centuries before resuming. But what if that darkness was simply the shadow cast by Alexandria's absence? What if the difference between our timeline and one where we're centuries more advanced is just a library that survived instead of burned? As you drift towards sleep tonight, you're doing something the ancient scholars valued above almost everything else. The quiet contemplation of knowledge, of mysteries, of questions that resist easy answers. They built their library for moments like this, for the wondering, for the reaching toward understanding that happens in stillness. The real tragedy isn't just what we lost, it's how easily we could have kept it. One different decision, one king who valued knowledge over politics, one fire that didn't start, that's all it would have taken. The difference between darkness and light can be that thin. Alexander the Great founded 70 cities and named most of them after himself, but only one would attempt to contain all human knowledge, and it bore his name. Stand with him in 332 BCE on the Egyptian coast. Sand stretches in every direction. The Mediterranean waves crash against a shoreline that offers nothing, no natural harbour worth mentioning, no freshwater source, no existing settlement to build upon, no obvious reason why anyone would choose this particular stretch of nothing to plant a city that would feed the world. But Alexander saw something. Perhaps he saw it the way prophets see visions, not what was there, but what could be. The location made no military sense. It made no economic sense. It violated every principle of practical city planning that the ancient world had developed. His generals must have exchanged glances, wondering if the conqueror who'd never lost a battle had finally lost his mind. According to legend, Alexander himself traced the city's boundaries. They had no chalk, so he used grain, pouring it in lines across the sand to mark where walls would rise, where streets would run, where the harbour would be carved from the coastline. Birds descended, thousands of them, and ate the grain, erasing his lines as quickly as he drew them. His generals saw catastrophe. The seers saw prophecy. This city would feed the world, but not with grain, with something else, something more lasting. Alexander never saw his city grow beyond foundations. He died in Babylon in 323 BCE, not yet 33 years old, his empire immediately fracturing into pieces as his generals carved up everything he'd conquered. One of those generals, Ptolemy, claimed Egypt. And with Egypt came the impossible city on the coast, barely begun, a vision without a visionary. Ptolemy could have abandoned Alexandria. He could have returned the capital to Memphis or Thebes, cities with thousands of years of history, with temples and infrastructure and tradition. Instead, he looked at Alexander's unfinished dream and saw opportunity. Not military opportunity. Ptolemy had spent enough years in battle to understand that military power was temporary. Empires rose and fell. Dynasties came and went. Conquest meant nothing if it couldn't outlast the conqueror. But cultural power, intellectual dominance, that could last forever. Ptolemy made a decision that would echo across millennia. He would finish Alexander's city, but he would transform its purpose. Alexandria wouldn't just be a capital or a trade hub. It would become the intellectual center of the world, the place where knowledge lived, where the smartest minds gathered, where human understanding itself would be collected, organized, and preserved. This wasn't pure altruism. Ptolemy understood that he was a usurper, a general who'd seized a throne through force and political maneuvering. He needed legitimacy, and he realized something brilliant. If he made Alexandria so culturally and intellectually vital that the world couldn't function without it, then by extension, the world couldn't ignore its ruler. His dynasty would command respect not through armies, but through irreplaceable contribution to human civilization. The question was, how? How do you create intellectual dominance? How do you convince the world's greatest minds to abandon their homes and come to your city? How do you build something that's never been built before? Ptolemy had a plan. It was audacious, expensive, unprecedented, and it would work beyond his wildest imaginings. Ptolemy understood something other kings didn't. An army can conquer land, but a library can conquer time itself. Most rulers in the ancient world patronized philosophers and artists for prestige. They'd hire a court philosopher, commission some poetry, maybe fund a sculpture or two. It was decoration, cultural window dressing to make power look sophisticated. Ptolemy envisioned something entirely different. He didn't want to hire scholars to make himself look good. He wanted to create an institution where knowledge itself was the goal. Not knowledge in service of the state, though that would come too, but knowledge pursued purely for its own sake. Research without immediate application, study without required outcome, the freedom to follow curiosity wherever it led. The concept was revolutionary. Ptolemy proposed to gather the best minds from across the known world, give them comfortable salaries from the state treasury, free them from financial worry, provide them with every resource they might need, and then simply ask, "What do you want to know? Go find out." He established the Mouseion, the House of the Muses, as a religious institution, which gave it special protections and privileges. Scholars who worked there weren't just employees of the state, they were servants of the divine, protected by the same laws that protected temples and priests. This meant they could pursue dangerous ideas, challenge conventional wisdom, question authority without fear of immediate political consequences. Ptolemy commissioned translations of important texts from every language into Greek. Not just Greek texts copied, but Egyptian hieroglyphic texts, Babylonian cuneiform tablets, Hebrew scriptures, Persian wisdom literature, everything translated and made accessible to scholars who shared Greek as a common language. This was more than preservation. It was creating a universal library where knowledge transcended cultural boundaries. The irony is rich. Ptolemy was a warrior, trained in combat, who'd spent his youth in Alexander's army conquering the known world. But he'd also studied philosophy under Strato of Lampsacus, who'd been taught by Theophrastus, who'd been taught by Aristotle himself. Ptolemy had direct connection to the greatest intellectual tradition of his age. He understood what systematic inquiry could accomplish, because he'd been taught by people who'd learned from the master himself. And Ptolemy didn't just patronize knowledge, he contributed to it. He wrote a history of Alexander's campaigns that became a primary source for later historians, including Arrian, whose account is now our most reliable narrative of Alexander's conquests. The ruler was also a scholar, practicing what he preached about the value of documented knowledge. But Ptolemy's masterstroke was acquisition. He wanted Aristotle's personal library, the actual books the philosopher had used, filled with his notes, his observations, his unpublished works. Through negotiation, purchase, or political pressure, the exact method is lost. Ptolemy acquired it. Aristotle's library became the seed collection, the nucleus around which everything else would accumulate. Think about what that meant. The books that Aristotle himself had read, annotated, referenced in his teaching, they were now in Alexandria. Scholars could study not just Aristotle's finished works, but see how he thought, how he developed ideas, what sources he used. That collection would grow. The question was how aggressively, how completely, and by what methods Alexandria would pursue the rest of the world's knowledge. Alexandria didn't ask permission to collect the world's knowledge. It simply took what it wanted legally, but without room for refusal. Ptolemy dispatched agents across the known world with a single mission: find books. They travelled to Athens, where philosophical schools guarded their texts; to Pergamum, where a rival library was beginning to form; to Rhodes, famous for its rhetoric schools; to Jerusalem, where religious texts were maintained with sacred care; to Babylon, where astronomical observations stretched back centuries. Everywhere humans had written things down, Alexandria's agents appeared, offering gold for manuscripts. But the most aggressive acquisition happened in Alexandria's own harbour. Every ship that docked faced an unusual inspection. After customs officials checked cargo and collected fees, another group boarded librarians and scribes. They searched for books. Any manuscript, any scroll, any written document found aboard was immediately confiscated and taken to the library. Expert scribes copied the text with meticulous care. Then came the twist. The library kept the original and returned the copy to the ship's owner. Not stolen, technically. The owners received compensation, but they had no choice in the matter. This was the price of entering Alexandria's harbour. The practice revealed something profound about how the Ptolemies valued knowledge. Originals mattered, not just the text, but the specific manuscript, the handwriting, the marginal notes, the corrections, all the human traces that showed how the document was created and used. Copies were adequate for returning to merchants. Originals belonged in Alexandria. The most scandalous story involves Athens itself. The city possessed the official state copies of the great tragedians Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. These weren't just books. They were cultural treasures, kept under guard, rarely allowed to leave the city. Ptolemy III allegedly requested to borrow them so Alexandria's scholars could study the authentic texts. Athens demanded an enormous deposit, 15 talents of silver, enough to buy a fleet of ships as guarantee of their return. Ptolemy paid it. Athens sent the precious manuscripts to Alexandria. Ptolemy's scribes made beautiful copies, and then Ptolemy kept the originals, forfeited the massive deposit, and sent Athens the copies instead. Whether this story is entirely true or exaggerated doesn't matter as much as what it reveals. Alexandria would pay any price, break any convention, sacrifice any amount of wealth to acquire original texts. Managing this flood of incoming knowledge required innovation. Callimachus, one of the library's scholars, created the Pinaeus, a 120-scroll catalogue organizing the entire collection by author, subject, and genre. It was the first systematic bibliography in human history, the first attempt to create order from the chaos of accumulated knowledge. But something unexpected happened as all these texts from different cultures arrived in one place. Knowledge began colliding, cross-pollinating, creating new ideas from the friction between different ways of understanding the world. For 2.5 centuries, the smartest people in the world came to Alexandria not to teach, but to learn from each other. The Mouseion wasn't just a library, it was a community. Scholars received stipends from the state treasury, enough to live comfortably without worrying about money. They ate together in communal dining halls, where conversations started over breakfast might continue through dinner. They walked in gardens while debating ideas, or sat in covered colonnades during Egypt's rare rain, arguing about mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, medicine. Any text they wanted to consult was available. Any colleague they wanted to debate was nearby. Euclid systematized geometry there, creating Elements, a textbook that would be used for 2,000 years. Eratosthenes calculated Earth's circumference by measuring shadows at different latitudes, arriving at a figure remarkably close to modern measurements. Archimedes visited and studied, developing principles of leverage and buoyancy. Hipparchus created the first comprehensive star catalogue, mapping the heavens with unprecedented precision. Hero of Alexandria invented a steam engine, though without the industrial context to make it useful. It remained a curious toy, a demonstration of principle rather than practical power. These weren't isolated geniuses working alone. They collaborated, built on each other's work, argued and refined ideas through debate. The empiricists believed in observation and experiment, show me the evidence. The theoreticians believed in pure mathematics. Logic reveals truth more reliably than messy physical observation. The skeptics questioned everything, insisting that certainty was impossible, and that wisdom lay in acknowledging what we couldn't know. This concentration of talent created something like critical mass. Ideas evolved faster here than anywhere else in the ancient world. Trigonometry developed from astronomical needs, medical knowledge advanced through systematic dissection and observation. New philosophical schools emerged from the collision of Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and Persian thought. The library represented humanity's best answer to forgetting. Normally, knowledge accumulates slowly and disappears quickly. A scholar makes a discovery, writes it down, dies. The manuscript survives for a generation, maybe 2, then deteriorates or gets lost. The next person who needs that information has to rediscover it from scratch. Humanity kept relearning the same lessons, losing and finding the same truths across centuries. But in Alexandria, for a brief window of history, that pattern broke. Knowledge accumulated faster than it disappeared. Each generation built on what the previous one had discovered, instead of starting over. The compounding effect was extraordinary. In 2 centuries, human understanding advanced more than it had in the previous 2,000 years. This was the Golden Age, the moment when everything seemed possible, when humanity's intellectual trajectory pointed upward without apparent limit, when the future looked like it would be nothing but continued enlightenment, endless discovery, permanent progress. No one knew how fragile it all was. how easily everything could be lost, how close civilization was to forgetting itself completely. Some scrolls in Alexandria were kept in restricted sections, not because they were valuable, but because the authorities feared what would happen if certain knowledge became widespread. Every library makes choices about what to preserve and what to discard. But Alexandria made a different choice. It preserved everything, even the dangerous things, especially the dangerous things. The library's protected status as a religious institution meant scholars could study materials that would have been burned anywhere else, books about magic that temple priests wanted destroyed, alchemical texts that claimed to transform lead into gold, alternative theologies that questioned the divine authority of kings, political philosophies arguing that rulers derived power from consent rather than heaven. Berossus, a Babylonian priest who moved to Greece in the 3rd century BCE, wrote a history of Babylon that contradicted biblical chronology. His work claimed Babylonian civilization stretched back hundreds of thousands of years, a timeline that made Hebrew scripture look recent and provincial. The religious authorities hated it, but Alexandria kept it, studied it, referenced it. Most of Berossus's work is now lost. We know it existed only because other ancient writers quoted fragments, usually while arguing against his claims. Manetho, an Egyptian priest, wrote a history of Egypt that presented pharaonic dynasties in ways that challenged Greek cultural supremacy. He suggested Egyptian civilization had achieved sophistication when Greeks were still scattered tribes. His chronology, his king lists, his descriptions of ancient Egyptian knowledge, all preserved in Alexandria, most of it lost now. We have epitomes, summaries, fragments quoted by later writers. The original work is gone. Philosophical texts existed in Alexandria that questioned everything people believed about power, property, and social order. Works arguing that slavery was morally indefensible. Treatises suggesting women deserved equal education. Texts proposing that government authority required justification beyond tradition. These ideas weren't just provocative, they were explosive. They threatened the foundations of ancient society. Astronomical works suggested Earth wasn't the center of the universe. Medical texts described human anatomy in ways that contradicted religious teachings about the soul's location. Mathematical treatises explored infinity in ways that troubled theologians. Natural philosophy that explained phenomena without invoking gods. Some scholars created private codes and cipher systems to protect certain information, not from thieves, from authorities. They knew some knowledge was dangerous. They knew certain ideas, if they spread too widely, could destabilize societies, threaten rulers, undermine religious institutions. So they wrote in ways that required initiation to understand. They embedded meanings in seemingly innocent texts. They protected knowledge while simultaneously preserving it. Ancient writers sometimes mentioned scrolls existing in single copies in Alexandria. Think about what that means. Not rare, unique. One copy of one text containing one set of ideas that existed nowhere else in the world. When that copy burned or rotted or was deliberately destroyed, the knowledge didn't become rare. It became extinct, completely erased from human history. Later book burnings weren't always random destruction. Sometimes they were targeted elimination. Religious authorities identifying and destroying specific texts that contradicted doctrine. Political rulers eliminating works that questioned their legitimacy. Conquerors burning libraries not just to demoralize defeated peoples but to erase dangerous ideas. Alexandria existed in constant tension. It was a state institution funded by royal patronage, but its scholars pursued truth regardless of political consequences. The kings who funded the library sometimes feared what it contained. They benefited from its prestige but worried about its contents. They wanted the world to see them as patrons of knowledge, while simultaneously ensuring certain knowledge remained restricted. Some scrolls never left the building. Some were available only to certain scholars. Some were studied but never copied for distribution. And when the library finally fell, those restricted texts vanished completely. We don't even know what questions they asked, let alone what answers they offered. In 50 CE, you could buy a drink from a vending machine in Alexandria. This technology then vanished for 1,800 years. Hero of Alexandria, an engineer and mathematician, created devices that sound like science fiction but were documented reality. His aeolipile was a working steam engine, a sphere that rotated when heated water created steam pressure. It generated rotational motion from heat energy. The principle that would power the Industrial Revolution, demonstrated and understood in the 1st century CE. But Hero lived in a world where slave labor was abundant and cheap. There was no economic incentive to develop steam power for industrial purposes. So it remained a curiosity, a temple trick, a demonstration of principle without practical application. Hero's inventions read like a catalogue of impossibilities. Automatic doors that opened when someone lit a fire on an altar, the heat-expanding air that pushed water, that created hydraulic pressure that moved the doors. A vending machine that dispensed holy water when you inserted a coin, the coin's weight triggered a mechanical release valve. A wind-powered organ that played music automatically. Programmable, automata mechanical figures that could perform sequences of actions based on preset patterns. Fire engines with pumps and valves, distance-measuring devices for chariots, crossbows that reloaded themselves. We know these devices existed because Hero wrote instruction manuals describing how to build them. Many of those manuals survived, copied by later scholars who found them fascinating even if they couldn't reconstruct the actual machines. But the technical expertise, the practical knowledge of how to work metal precisely enough, how to create seals that held pressure, how to engineer mechanisms that wouldn't jam or fail, much of that disappeared. Beyond Hero, Alexandria contained technical knowledge that wouldn't be matched for centuries. Medical texts described surgical procedures with detailed illustrations, operations on cataracts, removal of bladder stones, techniques for amputation that maximized survival chances. Galen's anatomical observations were based on systematic dissection and experiment, creating a body of medical knowledge that wouldn't be surpassed until the Renaissance. Roman concrete formulas that produce material still standing 2,000 years later, while modern concrete crumbles in decades. The recipe was lost. We've analyzed the surviving concrete, we understand its properties, but the exact production methods remain mysterious. Greek fire, a naval weapon that burned on water, terrifying enemy fleets, whose formula was guarded so carefully that it eventually disappeared entirely. Advanced metallurgy creating steel with properties we struggle to replicate. Damascus steel, whose forging techniques are still debated. Architectural knowledge that seems impossible. How to build structures that survived earthquakes in seismically active regions. How to create theatre acoustics so perfect that actors needed no amplification to be heard clearly by thousands. How to construct aqueducts that maintained precise gradients across miles of uneven terrain, delivering water to cities with populations in the hundreds of thousands. Astronomical instruments of stunning sophistication. The Antikythera mechanism, discovered in a shipwreck in 1901, demonstrated that ancient Greeks could build geared mechanical computers for calculating planetary positions. The device dates to the 2nd century BCE and matches technology that wouldn't reappear until medieval European clockmakers. We have this one artifact. How many similar devices were lost? Technological progress isn't inevitable. Under certain circumstances, civilizations forget how to do things they once did routinely. Skills that seem fundamental can evaporate in a generation if they're not actively taught and practiced. When Alexandria fell, it took practical knowledge that wouldn't be recovered through innovation but through archaeology. We literally had to dig up devices whose operating principles we'd forgotten. The ancient Greeks knew calculus. Not the name, but the methods. Then for over 1,000 years, humanity forgot how to calculate infinity. Euclid's Elements survived 13 books of systematic geometry that would be used as a textbook for 2 millennia. But Elements was introductory material. The advanced mathematics, the cutting-edge work happening in Alexandria, existed in other texts. Most of them didn't survive. Apollonius of Perga wrote 8 books on conic sections, the mathematical properties of circles, ellipses, parabolas, and hyperbolas. Some survived, others vanished. His work on the mathematics of circular motion, essential for understanding planetary orbits, was lost and had to be rediscovered centuries later when astronomers needed it again. Diophantus developed algebraic techniques in Alexandria during the 3rd century CE. He explored equations with multiple solutions, number theory problems, methods for solving polynomial equations. His work was early algebra symbolic manipulation of mathematical relationships. Most of it disappeared. When algebra was discovered in medieval Persia and Renaissance Europe, mathematicians were rediscovering methods Diophantus had already developed. Archimedes visited and studied in Alexandria. Some of his work survived through copies, but ancient writers reference treatises that are now lost, methods for calculating with infinite series approaching calculus through geometric reasoning, techniques for determining volumes of complex shapes by imagining them as infinite stacks of infinitely thin slices, essentially integration. Principles of hydrostatics explaining buoyancy and fluid pressure. Mechanical principles about leverage and compound pulleys. Eratosthenes calculated Earth's circumference by measuring shadows at different latitudes. This method survived through descriptions. But his work on prime numbers, his comprehensive geography text, his chronology of major events mostly lost. We have fragments, references, later writers mentioning, as Eratosthenes demonstrated, without providing the actual demonstration. Hipparchus created trigonometry for astronomical calculations. He developed methods for predicting eclipses, for calculating planetary positions, for understanding celestial motion. Much of his work survives only as described by Ptolemy 4 centuries later. Ptolemy's Almagest preserved Hipparchus's methods, but not his original writings, not his reasoning, not the observations and experiments that led to his conclusions. These losses created mathematical dark ages. Problems that had been solved became mysteries again. Techniques that had been common knowledge became lost arts. Proofs that had been understood by students had to be rediscovered by geniuses. Pappus of Alexandria, working in the 4th century CE, tried to preserve and explain earlier mathematical discoveries. But even in his time, many works were already lost. He wrote commentaries on texts that no longer existed, trying to reconstruct arguments from fragments and memory. He noted that certain techniques had been forgotten, that younger mathematicians couldn't solve problems their predecessors had considered elementary. Some mathematical knowledge was eventually recovered during the Islamic Golden Age. Scholars in Baghdad and Cairo found fragments of Greek mathematics, translated them, built on them. But even they worked with incomplete information, reconstructing methods from hints and partial descriptions. Other knowledge was lost completely. No fragments, no references detailed enough to reconstruct the original work. Just gaps where sophisticated mathematics used to be, forcing later civilizations to rediscover truths through independent reasoning because the original proofs had vanished. 1700 years before Copernicus, an Alexandrian astronomer suggested the Earth revolved around the Sunday. His work vanished so completely that history had to discover the truth all over again. Aristarchus of Samos proposed a heliocentric model in the 3rd century BCE, Sun at the center, Earth and other planets orbiting around it. This wasn't speculation or mysticism, it was mathematical astronomy, attempting to explain the observed motions of celestial bodies through geometric models. His full treatise is lost. We know about his theory only because other ancient writers mentioned it, usually to disagree with it. Aristarchus's arguments, his evidence, his calculations gone. Claudius Ptolemy's Almagest survived and dominated Western astronomy for 14 centuries, but Ptolemy was summarizing and building on earlier work. He referenced observations by Hipparchus, calculations by Apollonius, measurements by Eratosthenes. Much of that foundational work is lost. Hipparchus's star catalogue, considered more accurate than Ptolemy's, survives only as incorporated into later texts. His original observations, his methods, his reasoning mostly vanished. Alexandrian astronomers achieved remarkable precision. They predicted eclipses accurately. They tracked planetary movements and developed geometric models to explain retrograde motion. They understood Earth was a sphere and calculated its size. They measured the tilt of Earth's axis. Eratosthenes even attempted to measure the distance to the Sun. His result was less accurate than his calculation of Earth's circumference, but the attempt itself demonstrated sophisticated understanding of astronomy and geometry. Geographical knowledge vanished alongside astronomical understanding. Eratosthenes created maps with latitude and longitude, describing the known world with systematic coordinates. His comprehensive geography text, describing lands from Britain to India, from northern Europe to sub-Saharan Africa, is mostly lost. We have fragments preserved by later writers, but the complete work with its maps, its measurements, its descriptions of distant peoples and places disappeared. Alexandria had maps showing trade routes to India, detailed enough that merchants could navigate by them. Descriptions of African geography that wouldn't be matched by European explorers for over a millennium. Accounts of the Silk Road, of monsoon patterns in the Indian Ocean, of navigation techniques for long-distance sea travel. This knowledge evaporated. Medieval European maps were vastly inferior to what existed in ancient Alexandria. The detailed, mathematically rigorous cartography of Eratosthenes and Ptolemy was replaced by stylized, symbolic representations that prioritized theological correctness over geographical accuracy. Latitude and longitude disappeared from common use. The understanding that Earth was spherical remained among educated people, but the precise measurements of its size were lost. Navigational techniques vanished. How to calculate position by observing stars, how to use water clocks to estimate longitude, how to predict weather patterns for safe sea voyages, how to recognize ocean currents and seasonal winds. When the age of exploration began in the 15th century, European navigators were rediscovering techniques that Alexandrian sailors had mastered over 1,000 years earlier. The mathematical tools, the astronomical observations, the accumulated practical knowledge all had to be rebuilt from fragments and independent observation because the original texts had disappeared. Humanity circled the globe and mapped the continents while essentially starting from scratch, unaware that much of this work had already been done and documented, then lost. Ancient critics called them the greatest plays ever written. We know their titles and nothing else. The three great Greek tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, wrote approximately 300 plays between them. 33 survive complete. That means over 260 plays have vanished entirely, not damaged, not partially preserved, gone. We have their titles, sometimes a character's name, occasionally a line or two quoted by a later writer, who assumed everyone knew the original context. That's all. Aeschylus wrote a trilogy about Achilles. Ancient critics said it made his surviving works look crude by comparison. They described scenes of such emotional power that audiences wept openly. They praised its poetry as surpassing even his Oresteia, which modern readers consider a masterpiece. We know the trilogy's title, the Achilleid. We know it existed. We'll never read a word of it. Sophocles wrote a play about Odysseus that ancient critics considered his masterpiece, superior to Oedipus Rex, superior to Antigone, superior to everything else he created. They described it as the perfect synthesis of character, plot, and moral complexity. Gone. Euripides wrote satyr plays and comedies in addition to tragedies, displaying a range we can't fully appreciate because the works disappeared. We have his tragedies, but the complete picture of his artistic vision vanished with the lost plays. Alexandria's librarians possessed all of them, carefully copied, meticulously catalogued, available for scholars to study and theatre companies to perform. The library didn't just store these plays, it kept them alive. Theatrical competitions revived classical works regularly. Scholars wrote commentaries analysing their themes and techniques. Students memorised passages. The plays weren't artefacts but living texts, actively engaging with contemporary audiences. Comedy suffered the same fate. Aristophanes wrote 40 plays, 11 survive. Menander wrote over 100 plays. We have one complete play and substantial fragments of several others, the rest gone. And Menander influenced comedy for centuries. Roman playwrights adapted his works. Medieval and Renaissance writers studied his techniques, but we can't read most of what he wrote. Survival was random. Plays survived because they became popular teaching texts, selected by later educators for their moral content or linguistic clarity. Not necessarily because they were the best works, not because ancient audiences considered them superior, because someone decided they were suitable for students, and that meant they got copied more often, and copies had better chances of surviving. Sometimes modern scholars discover a fragment, a scrap of papyrus preserved by Egypt's dry climate, a few lines of a lost play wrapped around a mummy or buried in ancient garbage. The discovery creates excitement, we found something, mixed with profound frustration, because the fragment is usually just enough to suggest what we're missing. A stunning metaphor, a clever twist of plot, a character speaking with such authentic voice that you want to hear more, and you can't. That's all that survived. These plays shaped the ancient world's consciousness. They explored justice, fate, love, revenge, duty, ambition, the fundamental questions of human existence. People quoted them in daily conversation. Politicians referenced them in speeches. Philosophers used them as ethical case studies. The plays were woven into the culture's fabric, and now they're gone. The stories that moved audiences to tears and laughter. The characters that felt so real, people argued about their motivations. The poetry that people memorized and treasured. All of it vanished, leaving only titles and the haunting knowledge of absence. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey were part of an 8-poem cycle. The other 6 poems are gone, and with them, the complete story of the Trojan War. The epic cycle told the entire saga. The Cypria began before the war, describing the judgment of Paris and the gathering of Greek forces. The Aethiopis continued after the Iliad ended, telling of Achilles fighting the Amazon queen Penthesilea and Ethiopian king Memnon before dying from Paris's arrow. The Little Iliad and Sack of Troy described the Trojan horse and the city's destruction. The returns followed various Greek heroes' journeys home. The Telegony concluded with Odysseus's death at the hands of Telegonus, his son by Circe, whom he'd never met. Ancient readers experienced all of this as one connected narrative. They understood the Trojan War completely, its causes, its progression, its aftermath. Homer's poems were highlights within a larger story, not isolated works. Modern readers encounter the Iliad and Odyssey as if they're complete in themselves, missing the fuller context that shaped how ancient audiences understood heroism, fate, and divine justice. All 6 additional poems are completely lost. We have brief summaries written by a later scholar, perhaps in the 5th century CE, who assumed readers knew the stories and just needed quick reminders of plot points. These summaries reduce epic poems to a few paragraphs. Imagine summarizing the Iliad in 3 sentences. That's what we have for the entire rest of the Trojan War cycle. Historical writing suffered similar losses. Berossus, a Babylonian priest who wrote in Greek, created a comprehensive history of Babylon, drawing on cuneiform sources available in Mesopotamian temples. His chronology contradicted Greek and Hebrew accounts, claiming Babylonian civilization stretched back hundreds of thousands of years. Later writers quoted fragments when arguing against his claims, but the complete work disappeared. What we lost was an insider's view of Babylonian history, based on sources no longer available. Manetho's Egyptian history preserved pharaonic dynasties and chronologies. Modern archaeologists used fragments of his work to reconstruct Egyptian history before they could read hieroglyphics. But most of Manetho's text is gone. We have king lists and rough chronologies, but his detailed descriptions of each reign, his accounts of Egyptian religion and culture, his explanations of historical events lost. Alexander the Great's campaigns were documented by eyewitnesses who travelled with him. Ptolemy I himself wrote one account, Aristobulus wrote another. Nearchus, the admiral, described the fleet's journey. These primary sources are completely gone. We depend on later writers Arrian, Plutarch, Diodorus, who used these lost sources but filtered them through their own perspectives and agendas. We're reading history twice removed, never seeing the original accounts. Hecataeus wrote one of the first geographical and ethnographical texts describing the known world, its peoples, customs, and lands, mostly lost. Polybius wrote 40 books analyzing Rome's rise to power, including detailed military strategy and political analysis. Only the first 5 books survive complete. The rest, covering Rome's most dramatic conquests and expansion, exist only in fragments and later summaries. Autobiography and memoir disappeared too. Personal accounts by famous figures that would have given intimate insight into ancient life, how people actually thought, what they valued, how they made decisions. Not filtered through biographers or historians with agendas, but direct testimony. Gone. History as we know it is based on sources that survived by chance. Entire perspectives vanished. Alternative accounts disappeared. We're left with a fundamentally incomplete, potentially biased understanding of the ancient world, mistaking the surviving fraction for the whole story. Aristotle's lost dialogues were considered more beautiful than Plato's. We know this because ancient readers told us. We'll never know if they were right. Before Socrates, philosophers wrote extensively about reality's nature, the cosmos's structure, ethics, and knowledge. Heraclitus wrote about constant change and universal flux. Parmenides argued that change was illusion and reality was eternal and unchanging. Democritus developed atomic theory, proposing that everything consisted of tiny, indivisible particles moving through void. These weren't brief essays but comprehensive works exploring physics, metaphysics, ethics, and cosmology. Of all their writings, we have fragments. Brief quotations preserved when later philosophers cited them, usually to disagree. Democritus allegedly wrote 70 works covering atomic theory, ethics, mathematics, music, agriculture, and the nature of happiness. Virtually nothing survives complete. We have perhaps 100 brief passages, many just single sentences, quoted by people who had access to the full texts and assumed their readers did too. Alexandria housed complete collections. Scholars could read entire arguments, see how ideas developed, understand the full context of these thinkers' philosophical systems. That comprehensive access is gone. We're left reconstructing philosophies from fragments, like trying to understand a novel from random sentences pulled from different chapters. The Epicureans wrote extensively on pleasure, happiness, atomic physics, and how to live well. Epicurus himself produced over 300 scrolls. Almost all vanished. We recovered one major work, Lucretius's On the Nature of Things, written centuries later, which explains Epicurean physics and philosophy. But Epicurus's original arguments, his detailed reasoning, his responses to critics mostly gone, early Stoic works largely disappeared. The school's founders, Zeno, Cleanthes, Chrysippus, developed sophisticated arguments about logic, physics, and ethics. Chrysippus alone wrote over 700 works. We have fragments, brief quotations, later summaries. But Roman Stoicism, Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, represents the tradition's later development. We can't fully understand how the philosophy evolved because the early texts vanished. The skeptics argued against certainty itself, claiming we couldn't know anything with absolute confidence. Their arguments are known primarily through critics who wrote against them. We're understanding skeptical philosophy, filtered through people who disagreed with it. The irony is profound. Philosophy that questioned the possibility of certain knowledge is itself uncertain, lost, known only through hostile summaries. Aristotle's dialogues were polished literary works intended for public audiences, reportedly more eloquent and accessible than the technical treatises used in his school. Those treatises survived dense, difficult texts that were probably lecture notes. The beautiful dialogues everyone praised vanished completely. Alexandria's philosophers created commentaries explaining earlier works. They developed interpretations, raised objections, refined arguments. These commentaries are mostly lost, meaning we can't fully understand how ancient readers engaged with texts we still have. We read Plato or Aristotle directly, but miss centuries of sophisticated analysis that shaped how these texts were understood. Philosophy isn't just abstract argument, but living conversation spanning generations. Each thinker responds to predecessors, and successors respond to them. When major texts vanish, branches of that conversation end abruptly. Arguments remain unanswered. Questions stay unresolved. Insights that might have transformed later thinking disappear before they can influence anyone. We're left with a truncated philosophical tradition, mistaking our incomplete inheritance for the whole story. A man named Didymus wrote 3,500 books. His nickname was Bronze Guts. We have none of his works, but ancient readers considered him indispensable. Callimachus served as chief librarian and produced roughly 800 works: poetry, literary criticism, scholarly catalogues, mythological studies. We have 6 hymns and about 60 short epigrams. From 800 works, we have what amounts to a thin pamphlet. Ancient critics praised his elegance, his innovation, his perfect integration of learning and artistry. We can barely assess those claims because nearly everything disappeared. Apollonius of Rhodes wrote the Argonautica, the epic about Jason and the Golden Fleece. It survived, possibly by accident. His other works, scholarly commentaries, geographical studies, poems on other subjects vanished. We know one work by a man who wrote many. Theocritus created pastoral poetry that influenced literature for centuries. His shepherds and rural settings became templates for later poets. Most of his pastoral works survived. His other writings on different subjects, in different styles, are gone. We have a partial picture of his range. Didymus Chalcentaurus earned his nickname Bronze Guts because he wrote approximately 3,500 books, commentaries on Homer, the tragedians, the historians, grammatical studies, textual criticism, scholarly analysis of every major Greek writer. Of this enormous output, virtually nothing survives except through quotations. Later scholars referenced his work constantly, treated him as an authority, built on his research. But we can't read what he actually wrote. How do we know about these lost works? Through ancient library catalogues that survived. Through references in texts that did survive writers mentioning, as Callimachus demonstrated, or, according to Didymus. Through occasional papyrus discoveries. Parts of Menander's plays were found wrapped around mummy cartonnage, the papier-mâché-like material used in Egyptian burial practices. Someone tore up old scrolls to make mummy wrappings, inadvertently preserving fragments for 2,000 years. The Oxyrhynchus papyri texts discovered in an ancient garbage dump revealed fragments of lost works when archaeologists excavated the site. People threw away damaged or unwanted scrolls, and Egypt's dry climate preserved them in trash heaps where wet climates would have destroyed them. Preservation was random. A work might survive because it was popular enough to be copied repeatedly, or because one copy happened to be stored somewhere with conditions that preserved papyrus, or because someone chose it as a teaching text, or pure chance, right place, right conditions, right sequence of events that prevented destruction. The scholars we remember are often those whose works survived, not necessarily those most important in their own time. Reputation and influence in the ancient world didn't guarantee preservation. Bronze Guts wrote 3,500 books and is now a footnote. His works shaped scholarship for centuries, but vanished so completely we can't even reconstruct their arguments. These weren't just texts, they were life's work. Decades of research, writing, thinking, arguing, and then nothing. Names without works, reputations without evidence, absence where knowledge used to be. Everyone imagines a single moment. Flames reaching toward papyrus, smoke darkening the sky above Alexandria, screams as humanity's greatest collection of knowledge turns to ash in one catastrophic night. That image has burned itself into our collective memory, repeated in films and documentaries and popular histories, until it feels like established fact. But here's what they don't tell you. The Library of Alexandria didn't die that way at all. The real death began decades earlier, in quiet rooms where budgets were decided and appointments were made. It began when kings looked at ledgers instead of manuscripts, when political loyalty started mattering more than scholarly brilliance, when someone decided that perhaps the museum didn't need quite so much funding this year. By the 2nd century before the Common Era, the Ptolemaic dynasty was fracturing from within. The kings who had once competed to attract the greatest minds in the world were now fighting civil wars against their own siblings. Royal treasuries that had seemed bottomless were drying up. Egypt, which had maintained independence through cunning and wealth, was slowly being pulled into Rome's gravitational field, and the library changed with it. The position of chief librarian had once been awarded to the most distinguished scholar alive, Eratosthenes, who measured the Earth's circumference, Aristophanes of Byzantium, who revolutionized textual criticism. These were appointments that announced to the world, we value knowledge above everything. Then came appointments based on other criteria: political connections, family ties, loyalty to the crown during the latest succession crisis. The scholars selected might still be competent, but they hadn't been chosen for their revolutionary thinking. You can trace what happened next in the gaps that appear in the historical record. Fewer new acquisitions mentioned, longer intervals between major scholarly publications. The slow transformation of an institution from revolutionary to conservative, from leading to following. The museum, once a working research center where scholars disappeared into their studies for years, began functioning more as a social club. Visiting dignitaries received tours, political allies were granted positions. The dining hall hosted more banquets for Alexandria's elite than passionate debates about Homeric textual variants. Meanwhile, intellectual energy was flowing elsewhere. Pergamum's library was expanding aggressively. Rhodes had become a center for rhetoric and philosophy. Rome itself was beginning to attract Greek scholars. The cutting edge had moved on. By the 1st century before the Common Era, the Library of Alexandria was still the largest collection of texts in the world. Still impressive, still worth visiting, but no longer essential. No longer the place where the future was being invented. Egypt itself had become something different too. Technically independent under the last Ptolemies, it functioned as a Roman client state, and everyone knew what came next. Rome absorbed client states the way fire consumes oxygen. Inevitably, completely. The library didn't die by fire. First, it died by budget cuts, political appointments, and changed priorities. The burning came later, 48 years before the Common Era. Julius Caesar arrives in Alexandria, pursuing his rival Pompey, only to find himself trapped in a city convulsing with its own civil war. Cleopatra versus her brother Ptolemy, both claiming the throne, both willing to use Rome's most powerful general as a weapon against the other. Caesar's forces occupy the palace district. Egyptian troops mass outside. The harbour becomes a battlefield. And then comes the decision that will echo through 2,000 years of history. Caesar orders his men to set fire to the Egyptian fleet anchored in the harbour. Standard military tactic: deny the enemy their naval advantage. What happens next is confusion, smoke, and centuries of argument. The fire spreads. Wind carries it from ships to docks to warehouses lining the waterfront. Something burns, something significant. But what? Here's where it gets strange. Caesar himself writes extensively about the Alexandrian War. Detailed accounts of tactics, casualties, political maneuvering. He mentions the fire, describes the naval action. Never once mentions the library. Not a word about burning books. Not a hint of destroyed knowledge. Either he didn't consider it worth mentioning, or nothing happened to the library at all. But other sources tell different stories. Seneca, writing a century later, mentions 40,000 scrolls burning in Alexandria. 40,000, a staggering number. But he doesn't say where these scrolls were, or whether they were library holdings, just that they burned. Plutarch suggests books awaiting export caught fire, warehouses full of copies made for trade. Valuable, certainly, but not the library's irreplaceable collection. Then there's Dio Cassius, writing 250 years after the event. He states clearly that Caesar's fire destroyed the library. No ambiguity. But he's writing centuries later, possibly conflating multiple fires, multiple incidents into one dramatic narrative. So which version is true? Archaeological evidence offers no clear answer. Scholars continued working at the museum after Caesar's time. Strabo visits and describes the institution decades later. Something survived, but something also clearly burned. And that something involved books. The most likely truth sits uncomfortably in the middle ground. Some books burned. Maybe the export warehouses Plutarch mentioned. Maybe a portion of the collection housed near the harbour. Maybe thousands of scrolls. Maybe tens of thousands. But the library as an institution survived. The main collection endured. Scholars kept working. Yet here's what changed. The illusion of safety shattered. For 3 centuries, the library had existed in a bubble of protection. Royal patronage. Political stability. The understanding that some things transcend politics and war. Caesar's fire, whatever it actually destroyed, broke that understanding. Alexandria's intellectual treasures had proven vulnerable. Military conflict didn't respect the sanctity of knowledge. Fire didn't distinguish between warehouse, cargo, and irreplaceable manuscripts. Julius Caesar may have burned 40,000 scrolls. Or he may have burned none. The ancient sources disagree. But the real damage was psychological. The library was no longer safe. And once that protection was gone, everything else became only a matter of time. 30 years after Caesar's fire, Cleopatra dies. The last Ptolemaic ruler, the last pharaoh. Egypt becomes a Roman province, and with that transformation, everything changes for the library. No longer the crown jewel of an independent kingdom. No longer the project of kings who competed to own the world's knowledge. Now just another provincial institution in the vast machinery of empire, competing for resources with roads and aqueducts and grain subsidies. Some emperors cared. Claudius even built an addition to the museum, though whether from genuine interest or political showmanship remains unclear. Others ignored Alexandria entirely, focused on threats along the Rhine or intrigues in Rome itself. The funding that had once seemed automatic became uncertain. The stipends that allowed scholars to dedicate their lives to research without financial worry grew smaller, arrived later, sometimes didn't arrive at all. Positions went unfilled. The community of resident scholars shrank from hundreds to dozens, and the acquisition program that had built the collection simply ended. No more agents dispatched to Athens and Rhodes and Pergamum with unlimited budgets. No more searching ships in the harbour, confiscating books for copying. No more astronomical payments for rare manuscripts. The library stopped growing, started aging, because here's what most people don't understand about ancient books. They don't last. Papyrus deteriorates, ink fades, scrolls become brittle with handling. The only way to preserve a text is to copy it, again and again, generation after generation. It requires resources, skilled scribes, materials, time, money. Without adequate funding, the library couldn't maintain what it already possessed, let alone expand. Scrolls that became too fragile to unroll simply disappeared from the collection, lost not to fire but to entropy, to the simple physics of organic materials decaying over time. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, the museum still existed, still impressive to visitors, but it had transformed into something different, more of a rhetorical school, a gathering place for wealthy Romans on Egyptian tours, a remnant of past glory rather than a living centre of innovation. The scholars, who would have come to Alexandria a few centuries earlier, now went elsewhere. To Rome, where emperors built their own libraries. To Constantinople, the new capital of the Eastern Empire. To Christian institutions beginning to establish their own centres of learning. The intellectual world had moved on, left the library behind like a tide receding from a harbour. Empires change, and with them, priorities change. What seems essential to one generation becomes expendable to the next. The library was dying, but not from violence, from irrelevance, from the simple fact that nobody in power considered it important enough to save. For 1,000 years, the gods of Egypt and Greece had coexisted in Alexandria, Serapis and Zeus, Isis and Athena. The museum itself stood as a temple to the Muses, and scholarship was an act of worship. Then the empire converted. Constantine's vision before battle, Christianity becoming the state religion. Within a few generations, everything that had seemed eternal and unchanging faced a new reality. The old gods were now demons. Their temples were abominations, and institutions dedicated to them existed on borrowed time. The story often told is simple. Christians destroyed the library in anti-intellectual fury, but like everything else about the library's end, the truth fractures into complexity when you examine it closely. Many church fathers valued classical learning. Clement of Alexandria studied at the Mouseion. Origen worked there, incorporating Greek philosophy into Christian theology. Augustine quotes extensively from pagan authors. The finest minds of early Christianity didn't reject ancient knowledge. They tried to reconcile it with new faith, but others saw only danger. Theophilus, Bishop of Alexandria in the late 4th century, viewed pagan temples as enemies to be eliminated. When Emperor Theodosius authorized the destruction of pagan sites, Theophilus moved against the Serapeum, the great temple complex that housed part of the library's collection. The year was 391. Christian mobs, led by the bishop himself, tore down the temple, smashed statues, desecrated what they considered idolatrous spaces. What happened to the books inside remains uncertain. Some scholars suggest the collection had already been dispersed. Others believe scrolls were destroyed alongside the pagan imagery. The sources, as usual, disagree. But something was lost that day. Whether thousands of scrolls or an already emptied building, the Serapeum fell, and with it, another piece of the library's existence. Yet this wasn't necessarily hatred of knowledge itself. It was religious conflict where books became collateral damage. The texts weren't targeted for what they contained, but for where they were housed. A pagan temple. Enemy territory in a cosmic war. The broader transformation mattered more than any single incident. As Christianity became dominant, education itself changed. Classical texts were still studied, but selectively. Works compatible with Christian doctrine were copied, preserved, passed to future generations. Others were simply neglected. Not banned, not burned, just not considered worth the expense of recopying as they deteriorated. This selective preservation fundamentally altered what survived. We have more Christian texts from this period, not because more were written, but because scribes chose what deserved immortality. When the gods changed, so did the definition of knowledge worth preserving. Some books became sacred, others became dangerous, many simply became irrelevant. And in that transformation, the library's founding principle died. The idea that all knowledge deserves preservation, regardless of origin or orthodoxy. That universalist vision couldn't survive in a world divided into saved and damned, orthodox and heretical, us and them. Ask a historian when the Library of Alexandria was destroyed, and watch what happens. Some will say 48 years before the Common Era, when Caesar's fire swept the harbour. Others insist on 272, during Aurelian's siege. Many point to 391, when the Serapeum fell. A few argue for 642 and the Arab conquest. All of them will cite ancient sources. All of them will present evidence. All of them will be convinced they're right. Ask when the Library of Alexandria was destroyed, and you'll get at least 4 different answers from scholars, all citing ancient sources, all convinced they're right. This isn't a failure of scholarship. It's the nature of the evidence itself. The ancient sources contradict each other. Writers describe destructions separated by centuries as if they're talking about the same event. Historians writing 500 years after an incident report details as if they witnessed them personally. Political and religious motivations shape every account. And beneath all the conflicting testimony lies a possibility more unsettling than any single catastrophe. Maybe there was no single moment of destruction at all. Consider what we know for certain. The library existed in the 3rd century before the Common Era. By the 5th century of the Common Era, it was gone. Between those points stretch 800 years of fragmentary evidence, partial accounts, and educated guesses. Caesar's fire in 48 BCE definitely happened. Something burned. Ancient sources confirm it. Whether that something included the library remains disputed. Aurelian's attack on the Mouseion district in 272 CE is documented. The quarter housing the museum was devastated. But did the library still exist there by that time? Sources don't say. The Serapeum's destruction in 391 CE is beyond question. Christian and pagan sources both describe it. But was the library collection still housed there? Or had it been moved, dispersed, scattered decades earlier? Nobody recorded the answer. The Arab conquest story appears 6 centuries after the supposed event, told by writers with obvious bias. Most scholars consider it fabricated propaganda. But it persists in popular imagination because it offers what people want, a clear ending. Modern archaeology can't resolve these questions. Libraries don't leave distinctive ruins. Ancient Alexandria lies buried under a modern city of 5 million people. The royal quarter, including the likely location of the original library, is submerged underwater following earthquakes and subsidence. Historians examine texts, comparing manuscripts, analyzing linguistic patterns, trying to determine which sources are reliable. Archaeologists study burn layers and destruction horizons. Classicists trace citations to determine when scholars stopped referencing library texts. Each discipline offers pieces of a puzzle that refuses to form a complete picture. The most likely answer is also the most frustrating. The library died multiple deaths. Different parts of the collection were lost at different times. The institution declined gradually, wounded repeatedly, fading rather than vanishing in flames. No single villain, no dramatic moment, just the slow entropy of political change, religious transformation, economic decline, and human indifference. We want simple narratives. History offers messy ambiguity. We want tragic moments we can point to and say, "There, that's when greatness died." History whispers that greatness usually bleeds out slowly, in rooms where nobody's paying attention. 272 years into the Common Era, the Roman Empire is fracturing. Piece by piece, provinces are breaking away, declaring independence or swearing allegiance to rival emperors. In the east, Queen Zenobia of Palmyra has conquered Egypt, adding it to an empire stretching from Syria to the Nile. Emperor Aurelian decides to take it back. His legions march through the desert. They reach Alexandria, the jewel of Egypt, and find the gates barred against them. The city chooses Zenobia. Aurelian begins a siege. What happens next appears in the Historia Augusta, a strange and unreliable collection of imperial biographies. But archaeological evidence confirms the essential truth. The Mouseion quarter burned. Extensively, catastrophically. The Mouseion quarter, the royal district, where the palace stood, where the museum stood, where, presumably, the library stood. Ancient historians recorded the burning of the Mouseion. They described Aurelian's fury at the city's resistance. They noted the destruction of this once magnificent district, and then, inexplicably, they forgot to mention whether the library burned too. In 272 CE, a Roman emperor burned the district, containing the library to reclaim it from a rebel queen. Ancient historians recorded the destruction, but somehow forgot to mention whether the library burned too. The silence is strange. The Historia Augusta mentions other buildings destroyed, describes the devastation, but no word about the library specifically. Either it wasn't there anymore, or its destruction seemed unremarkable, or the writer simply didn't care. Archaeology offers some confirmation. Burn layers from this period exist in Alexandria's archaeological record. Buildings in the royal quarter show evidence of fire and violence. The physical evidence matches the written accounts. But libraries don't leave distinctive remains. Papyrus burns to ash, scrolls leave no traces. Even the building itself, if it was damaged or destroyed, would look like any other ruined structure. So we're left with probabilities rather than certainties. If the library building was still in the Mouseion in 272, it would have been vulnerable. Soldiers don't distinguish between buildings during sieges. Fire doesn't check addresses before spreading. Even if the structure survived, the disruption would have been catastrophic. Scholars fleeing the fighting. Collections scattered or looted. The institutional framework that kept the library functioning shattered by war. And consider the context. This is the crisis of the 3rd century. Emperors changing every few years. Economic collapse. Military threats from every direction. Even if some books survived Aurelian's fire, who remained to care for them? Who had resources to maintain a research library when the empire itself was barely functioning? Rome in this period couldn't protect its own borders. It certainly couldn't preserve provincial libraries. The Aurelian destruction is forgotten because it lacks drama, no religious conflict, no famous names, just another siege and another civil war during a century of chaos. But forgotten doesn't mean unimportant. This fire, whether or not it destroyed the library building, occurred during Alexandria's transformation from great cultural capital to struggling provincial city. Even if books survived, the community that gave them meaning was dissolving. The Serapeum stood on Alexandria's highest point, a temple complex so magnificent that ancient writers compared it to the Capitoline Hill in Rome. Courtyards and colonnades, libraries and lecture halls, the dwelling place of Serapis, a god invented by the Ptolemies to unite Greek and Egyptian worshippers under one divine figure, and somewhere within its walls, a daughter library, a branch of the great collection. Exactly how many scrolls it contained, nobody alive today can say. By the late 4th century, Alexandria had become a battlefield, not of armies but of faiths. Christians and pagans fought in the streets, philosophers were murdered, temples were attacked and defended. The city that had once welcomed all traditions now forced people to choose sides. Theophilus, Christian patriarch of Alexandria, saw paganism as an enemy to be eliminated. When Emperor Theodosius outlawed pagan worship in 391, Theophilus received the permission he'd been waiting for. He led a mob to the Serapeum. What happened next is documented by multiple sources. Socrates, Scholasticus, and Sozomen, Christian historians writing decades later, describe the destruction. The temple torn down stone by stone, statues of Serapis smashed, sacred spaces desecrated and converted to Christian use. The Serapeum fell, that much is certain. But what happened to the books? Here the sources diverge into silence and contradiction. Some ancient writers mention books. Others describe the temple's destruction in detail without mentioning scrolls at all. That silence feels significant. But significant how? Does it mean the books weren't there, or that their destruction was too shameful to record, or simply that the writers didn't consider them important? When a Christian mob destroyed the Serapeum temple in 391 CE, did they burn books or an empty library? Ancient witnesses saw the destruction, but somehow none mentioned what happened to the scrolls. Modern scholars have argued both possibilities. Some point to evidence that the library collection had been moved years or decades earlier, perhaps to the Caesareum, perhaps dispersed to private collections, perhaps already destroyed in earlier violence. Others insist the daughter library was still functioning in 391, still housing texts, still serving scholars, and therefore destroyed when the temple fell. The absence of contemporary Christian accounts describing book burning seems telling. Christian writers of this period weren't shy about recording their victories over paganism. They documented temple destructions, idol smashing, conversion of sacred spaces. If they'd burned a major library collection, wouldn't they have mentioned it, either as triumph over pagan knowledge or as preservation of useful texts? But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Maybe the books were destroyed and nobody thought to record it. Maybe the destruction happened so quickly, in such chaos, that nobody knew exactly what was lost until later. Or maybe the books were already gone. Consider the timeline. 391 CE, 7 centuries after the library's founding, after Caesar's fire, after Aurelian's siege, after decades of Christian-pagan violence in Alexandria, after the gradual decline of funding and support. Would a major collection of irreplaceable texts still be housed in a pagan temple during a period of religious warfare? Or would they have been moved, sold, dispersed, lost to earlier conflicts? We know the Serapeum was destroyed. We know it once housed books. We cannot prove when the books disappeared. Just another missing piece in a puzzle that refuses completion. The story goes like this. 642 CE. Arab forces under General Amr ibn al-As conquer Alexandria. A Christian scholar named John Philoponus asks Amr to spare the library. Amr, uncertain, sends a messenger to Caliph Umar in Medina. Umar sends back his judgment. Books that contradict the Quran are heretical and should be destroyed. Books that agree with the Quran are redundant and also should be destroyed. Therefore burn them all. The scrolls are distributed to Alexandria's bathhouses, used as fuel to heat water. The burning lasts 6 months. It's a powerful story, clear villain. Dramatic destruction. Religious fanaticism destroying human knowledge. It appears in books, documentaries, popular histories. Many people believe it without question. There's just one problem. It's almost certainly false. The story first appears 600 years after the supposed event. Abd al-Latif al-Baghdadi mentions it in the early 13th century. Bar Hebraeus, a Christian historian, repeats it later in the same century. Both are writing during or shortly after the Crusades, a period when Christian and Muslim writers needed propaganda to justify their conflicts. Not a single contemporary source mentions this destruction. Not Arab historians documenting the conquest. Not Byzantine writers describing Alexandria's fall. Not Christian or Jewish scholars living in Alexandria under early Islamic rule. 6 centuries of silence before the story suddenly appears, fully formed, in the work of writers with obvious religious and political motivations. The most popular story about the library's destruction is probably false, appears 600 years after the supposed event, and conveniently blames religious enemies of the Christian writers who recorded it. Modern scholars, including Islamic historians, generally reject the account as fabricated. The reasoning attributed to Caliph Umar doesn't match his actual documented policies toward learning and scholarship. The timeline doesn't work by 642. Most scholars believe the library had already ceased to exist. And the story has hallmarks of religious polemic rather than historical record. Contemporary accounts of the Arab conquest describe it as relatively peaceful. Treaties guaranteed protection for Christians and Jews. Scholars continued their work. The early Islamic period in Alexandria actually saw increased intellectual activity, with Arab scholars translating Greek philosophical and scientific texts into Arabic. Those translations, preserved when the originals were lost, eventually made their way back to Europe and helped trigger the Renaissance. Ironic, if Arab conquerors were supposedly burning the very books their descendants would labor to preserve. So, why does the story persist? Because it's perfect. Simple narrative, clear blame. A dramatic single event, rather than complicated gradual decline. It fits contemporary religious and political conflicts. It offers emotional satisfaction that messy historical truth cannot provide. We want villains we can point to. We want moments we can mark on timelines. We want to believe that great losses have great causes, that catastrophes are dramatic and decisive. The actual Arab conquest probably affected whatever remained of the library, if anything remained at all. New rulers meant new priorities, cultural transformation, different values about what knowledge mattered, but that's a complicated story of gradual change, not a 6-month book burning. False narratives can be more powerful than truth, especially when they serve political purposes. The library's destruction was probably complex, multifaceted, spread across centuries, but we prefer stories where blame is clear and endings are definitive. History doesn't always cooperate with what we prefer. Galen, the most famous physician of antiquity, wrote constantly about other doctors, earlier researchers, better anatomists, surgeons whose techniques he couldn't quite replicate. He cited their works, referenced their discoveries, built his practice on their foundations. Those works are gone now. Lost. We have Galen's descriptions of what other doctors discovered, but not their original research, not their detailed observations, not their specific techniques. And the loss is measured in bodies. Herophilus and Eratosthenes worked in Alexandria during the 3rd century before the Common Era. They performed human dissection, a practice that wouldn't be widely accepted again until the Renaissance, 1500 years later. Through careful cutting and observation, they mapped the nervous system, distinguished between sensory and motor nerves, understood that the brain, not the heart, controlled the body. Erasistratus described the circulatory system with remarkable accuracy, traced blood vessels, understood how the heart functioned as a pump. This knowledge vanished. Medieval physicians thought the liver created blood, which then ebbed and flowed through the body like tides. Their complete works are lost. We have fragments, summaries, citations by later doctors who had access to the full texts, but not the detailed anatomical drawings, not the surgical protocols, not the accumulated observations from hundreds of dissections. Ancient physicians performed successful cataract surgeries. The technique is described in texts that survived, but more advanced procedures are only mentioned in fragments. Caesarean sections performed with the mother surviving, rare but documented. Orthopedic procedures for setting complex fractures that medieval medicine couldn't match. They had pain management, not just opium, which survived in common knowledge, but sophisticated combinations of drugs with different effects. Anesthetics for surgery, post-operative care protocols, dosing guidelines that prevented addiction while controlling pain. Lost. The pharmaceutical knowledge might be the cruelest loss. Ancient physicians catalogued hundreds of plant remedies, not folk medicine or superstition, but systematic documentation. Which plants helped which conditions, how to prepare them, proper dosages, dangerous interactions, storage methods to preserve potency. Some of this was preserved through continuous practice. Herbal remedies passed down through generations, but the theoretical understanding was lost. Why these plants worked, how to identify related species that might have similar effects, how to create new preparations for conditions the traditional remedies didn't address. During the Black Death, millions died. Medieval physicians tried bleeding patients, burning aromatic herbs, fleeing the cities. They had no framework for understanding contagious disease. But ancient physicians did. They understood quarantine, recognized that disease spread from person to person through some invisible mechanism, developed protocols for isolation and prevention. This knowledge appears in fragments enough to know they had it, not enough to reconstruct it fully. Ancient physicians performed brain surgery successfully. Medieval physicians thought demons caused disease. The knowledge connecting one era to the next burned with the library. The theoretical understanding might be the deepest loss. Some ancient physicians practiced evidence-based medicine, systematic observation, clinical trials comparing treatments, record-keeping to track outcomes. They understood disease as natural phenomenon following natural laws, not divine punishment or demonic possession. This approach was lost. Not completely. Some Arabic physicians maintained it, some Byzantine doctors preserved elements. But the comprehensive works, explaining the methodology, providing examples, teaching the practice, those vanished. We can calculate the cost, roughly, conservatively. How many plague deaths might have been prevented with proper quarantine protocols? How many women might have survived childbirth with better obstetric knowledge? How many infections might have been controlled with proper wound care? The numbers become abstract, too large to comprehend. Millions, certainly. Possibly tens of millions across the centuries between Alexandria's fall and the scientific revolution. The knowledge existed, was written down, was preserved in a library, and then wasn't. The Pantheon stands in Rome, built in 126 CE. Its dome spans 43 meters across. For 1300 years, no civilization could build anything larger. Not because they lacked ambition, not because they didn't try, because they'd forgotten how. The Pantheon's dome, built in 126 CE, wasn't matched in size for 1,300 years. Not because later civilizations lacked ambition, but because they'd forgotten how. Roman concrete made it possible. Not just any concrete, a specific formula using volcanic ash that created chemical reactions, making the structure stronger over time. Especially the underwater concrete used in harbor construction, which modern analysis shows was superior to modern Portland cement in marine environments. The formula was partially lost. Engineers knew concrete existed, knew roughly what went into it, but the precise ratios, the specific types of volcanic ash, the curing techniques, those details disappeared. We had to reverse engineer it. Study ancient structures, analyze the chemical composition, run experiments trying to recreate what ancient engineers did routinely. Hero of Alexandria wrote extensively about his inventions. The Pneumatica described devices using steam power, water pressure, compressed air. The Automata detailed programmable mechanical systems, ancient robots essentially, performing complex sequences of movements. The Dioptra explained surveying instruments and mathematical techniques for engineering projects. Summaries survived, descriptions. But the detailed technical specifications, the measurements, the material requirements, the step-by-step construction processes, those are largely gone. Try building a steam engine from a description that someone built a steam engine. You'll understand the problem. Ancient architects created perfect acoustics in theatres, seating thousands, no amplification. Every seat could hear clearly. They understood sound propagation, reflection, resonance. Medieval cathedrals tried to recreate this and mostly failed. The knowledge was lost. Dome construction remained a mystery until Brunelleschi's Florence dome in the 15th century. He reinvented techniques that ancient builders had used for over a millennium: self-supporting construction, weight distribution, double shell design. Metallurgy offers the same pattern. Damascus steel blades, flexible, incredibly strong, holding an edge better than anything Europe could produce. The technique was eventually lost even in Damascus. Modern metallurgists examined ancient blades under electron microscopes, discovered carbon nanotubes in the structure, still can't quite replicate the original process. Ancient engineers built aqueducts that functioned for centuries, calculated gradients precise enough to maintain flow over dozens of miles, designed settling tanks, pressure systems, distribution networks. Some Roman aqueducts still work today. The calculation methods they used? Lost. Rediscovered through surveying and reverse engineering the structures themselves. Climate control without modern technology. Buildings designed to naturally cool in hot climates through airflow patterns, thermal mass, strategic placement. These techniques were forgotten, are only now being rediscovered as sustainable architecture. The pattern repeats across dozens of technologies. Colored glass formulas, architectural acoustics, water lifting devices, precision measurement instruments. We know they existed because we have the objects. Ancient structures still standing, artifacts in museums, descriptions in surviving texts that reference the lost technical manuals. But knowledge without transmission is just archaeology. Each generation had to relearn what previous generations knew, if they could figure it out at all. Progress isn't linear. Civilizations forget. Technology regresses. The knowledge survives only if each generation carefully preserves it and passes it forward. Alexandria tried. The library was that preservation, that careful passing forward. Then the chain broke. Eratosthenes calculated Earth's circumference in the 3rd century before the Common Era. He was accurate within a few percent. He created a map of the known world with latitude and longitude lines showing Africa, Asia, and Europe in their proper proportions. 1,000 years later, medieval European maps showed Earth as a flat disk with Jerusalem at the center, seas filled with monsters, the edges marked, "Here be dragons." Medieval European maps showed Earth as flat with Jerusalem at the center. Ancient Alexandrian maps showed a spherical Earth with accurate distances. The knowledge regressed before it progressed again. The maps were lost. Not just Eratosthenes' work, but the accumulated geographical knowledge of centuries. Trade route documentation, explorer accounts, merchant reports from journeys to India, China, deep into Africa. Ancient geographers knew Africa extended far south, had reports from expeditions around the continent, understood the Indian Ocean's size and the lands surrounding it, documented northern European tribes and geography in detail. Some of this knowledge seems to have included lands Europeans would later discover, references to Atlantic islands, possible accounts of lands west of Africa, navigation techniques for crossing open ocean using star positions and ocean currents. We can't be certain, because the detailed accounts are gone. We have mentions, brief references in surviving texts to fuller descriptions now lost, tantalizing fragments, suggesting knowledge that medieval Europe lacked completely. Marinus of Tyre compiled geographical information that Ptolemy used for his famous geography. But Marinus's own work is lost. Ptolemy summarized it, selected from it, edited it. What did Ptolemy leave out? What details seemed unimportant to him, but would be invaluable to us? We'll never know. Navigation techniques vanished. Ancient sailors could calculate longitude using lunar eclipses and careful timekeeping, could determine latitude from star positions with impressive accuracy, could predict weather from ocean conditions, cloud formations, bird behavior. When medieval Europeans began exploring beyond the Mediterranean, they lacked knowledge that ancient sailors had mastered. They navigated by dead reckoning, hugging coastlines when possible, venturing into open ocean only with enormous risk. Viking navigators preserved some techniques through oral tradition, but the systematic scientific approach developed in Alexandria, written down, tested, refined over generations, that was lost. The ethnographical knowledge might be the most frustrating loss. Ancient travelers described distant cultures in detail, languages, customs, beliefs, trade practices, political systems. These accounts existed in the library, translated and preserved. When Europeans encountered these same cultures centuries later, they thought they were discovering the unknown, but ancient scholars had already documented much of it. The descriptions existed, were lost, had to be rediscovered through new contact, often violent contact. Geographical knowledge is power. It enables trade, enables exploration, enables cultural exchange. Its loss meant centuries of isolation, rediscovery, conflict that might have been avoided. The world was larger to ancient scholars than to medieval ones. not because the world had shrunk, but because knowledge had contracted. The horizon of the known had pulled inward. When the library burned, the world became smaller, more mysterious, less connected. Eventually, exploration expanded that horizon again. But think of the centuries between. The knowledge existing, then lost, then slowly, painfully rediscovered. For over 1,000 years, Egyptian hieroglyphs were mysterious symbols carved on ancient monuments. Beautiful, indecipherable. The language of the pharaohs had been lost. Then in 1799, soldiers found the Rosetta Stone. Same text in 3 languages: hieroglyphic, Demotic, Greek. Scholars could finally translate, could finally read what ancient Egyptians had written about themselves. Before that discovery, we knew ancient Egypt only through Greek and Roman descriptions, through the eyes of foreigners, often prejudiced, always filtering Egyptian culture through their own assumptions. The Library of Alexandria held Egyptian literature, written by Egyptians. The Book of Thoth, religious and magical texts, historical accounts, medical papyri, scientific treatises, all translated into Greek, making them accessible to the broader Mediterranean world. Those translations are lost. We know ancient Egypt through Greek eyes because the Egyptians' own extensive literature of themselves was lost. The library held both perspectives. Now, we have only one. The same pattern repeats across cultures. Etruscan literature existed. The Etruscans were literate, sophisticated, influential in early Rome. Their books were in Alexandria. Now we have only brief inscriptions on tombs and monuments. The language is partially understood. Their literature is essentially gone. Mesopotamian works suffered similar fate. Clay tablets survived because clay is durable. But sophisticated Babylonian astronomy, mathematics, philosophy written in Greek translation, those texts were in Alexandria, lost now. We know they existed because later writers referenced them. Babylonian astronomers kept detailed records for centuries, tracked planetary movements with remarkable precision. Their observations, translated and preserved in Alexandria, influenced Greek astronomical theory. The original records, spanning generations of careful observation, are mostly lost. Persian philosophical texts, Indian mathematical treatises, Phoenician historical accounts, all translated into Greek in Alexandria, all making diverse cultural knowledge accessible to anyone who could read Greek. When these translations vanished, access to entire traditions disappeared. We have what those cultures wrote on durable materials, stone, clay, but their literature, philosophy, science written on papyrus or preserved only in translation, gone. This creates a profoundly distorted historical view. We have extensive records of Greek and Roman civilization. We know their philosophers, playwrights, historians, scientists. We know other contemporary cultures, primarily through Greek and Roman descriptions. But Alexandria offered something different. Multicultural perspective. Accounts written by Egyptians about Egypt, by Phoenicians about Phoenician history, by Jews about Jewish tradition, by Persians about Persian philosophy. These alternative voices would have balanced the historical record, would have shown us how these cultures saw themselves, not just how Greeks and Romans saw them. The loss isn't just information, it's perspective, worldview, ways of thinking that we can barely reconstruct from fragments. Some languages we can't read anymore, some cultures we know only through their conquerors' accounts. Some philosophical traditions survived only in distorted summaries by people who didn't really understand them. The library was a repository of voices, thousands of authors from dozens of cultures across centuries, speaking in their own words about their own experiences. Those voices are silent now, not because nobody wrote them down, not because they were never preserved, but because the preservation failed. We hear echoes, fragments, summaries of summaries, but the actual voices, the direct testimony, the unfiltered perspective that's lost in the silence. 1897. 2 archaeologists, Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt, excavate an ancient garbage dump in Oxyrhynchus, Egypt. Not a glamorous sight, just the place where a provincial town threw its trash for centuries. They start finding papyrus, fragments, scraps, torn pieces of documents discarded 1,500 years earlier, and as they sift through the rubbish, they realize what they've found. Poetry by Sappho, previously known only through brief quotations. Lost plays by Sophocles and Euripides. Gospel texts that didn't make it into the Bible. Mathematical treatises. Private letters, shopping lists, receipts, the mundane and the extraordinary mixed together in the debris of daily life. Hundreds of thousands of fragments, still being studied today, still yielding discoveries. And each discovery creates equal parts excitement and frustration. Here's a fragment of a lost play. 10 lines survive. Just enough to reveal the plot was different from anything we knew about. Just enough to show the writing was brilliant. Not enough to know how it ended, what happened to the characters, why it was written. Sometimes, in ancient garbage dumps and scraped clean parchments, we find echoes of the library. A few lines of poetry, a fragment of mathematics, enough to make us ache for the complete text we'll never read. Fragments surface from unexpected places. Writers quote lost works. A historian mentions a text while making an argument. A philosopher references an earlier scholar. These quotations survive even when the original doesn't. We reconstruct knowledge from citations, like archaeologists reconstructing pottery from scattered shards. Medieval Arabic translations preserved Greek works lost in Greek. Islamic scholars in Baghdad translated Aristotle, Ptolemy, Galen, mathematical treatises, astronomical observations. When these Arabic versions were translated back to Latin centuries later, European scholars rediscovered knowledge that had vanished from Europe completely. Palimpsests offer another source of fragments. Parchment was expensive. Scribes sometimes scraped off earlier writing to reuse the material. Medieval monks erased mathematical texts to write prayers, erased classical literature to copy religious works. But erasure isn't always complete. Modern imaging can recover the underlying text. Multispectral photography reveals ink invisible to normal vision. The Archimedes palimpsest, a 13th century prayer book, created by scraping off a 10th century copy of Archimedes' works, has yielded lost mathematical treatises through careful imaging. The Herculaneum papyri present a different challenge. When Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, it buried the town of Herculaneum in superheated material. A private library carbonized instantly. The scrolls survived, but as fragile carbon cylinders that crumble when touched. For centuries, they were unreadable. Opening them destroyed them. Now, X-ray tomography can read the scrolls without unrolling them. Artificial intelligence enhances the images, distinguishes ink from papyrus. Slowly, lost philosophical works are being recovered from what looked like charcoal. Each technological advance reveals more fragments. Satellite imaging finds buried structures. Ground-penetrating radar maps ancient cities. Digital analysis discovers patterns in damaged manuscripts. And each discovery emphasizes how much more is lost. Every recovered fragment is a window into a larger work we'll never fully see. Every line of poetry suggests stanzas we'll never read. Every mathematical proof hints at treatises now gone. The fragments are precious. They expand our knowledge, surprise us with discoveries, challenge our assumptions about what ancient scholars knew. But they're also reminders, evidence of absence, proof that vast libraries of knowledge existed and vanished. Each fragment is simultaneously treasure and gravestone. Photios of Constantinople never meant to become a lifeline to lost knowledge. He was a 9th century Byzantine patriarch, scholar, diplomat. He loved books, and so, while serving as ambassador to Baghdad, he wrote letters home describing what he was reading. He called it the Bibliotheca, a catalogue of books with summaries and commentary. Nearly 300 works described in detail. His opinions about writing quality, his thoughts on the author's arguments, notes about particularly interesting passages, casual reading notes, personal literary criticism. Nothing more ambitious than sharing his enthusiasm for books with friends. More than half the works he described are now lost, gone completely. His summaries are all we have. A 9th century Byzantine bishop saved knowledge he didn't know was endangered. He simply wrote about books he enjoyed. Those books are now gone. His notes are all we have. Athenaeus did something similar in the 3rd century. His Diepnosophistae, the learned banqueters, describes a dinner party where guests discuss literature, food, music, philosophy. They quote extensively from hundreds of authors. Many of those authors survive only through Athenaeus's quotations. He wasn't trying to preserve endangered knowledge. He was writing an entertaining book about cultured conversation. The preservation happened accidentally. Stobaeus compiled an anthology in the 5th century. Excerpts from classical authors, arranged by topic, moral philosophy, natural science, politics, selections meant to educate his son. Many of those selections are the only surviving fragments of their source works. None of these scholars knew they were performing preservation work. They were just reading, enjoying, sharing what they found interesting. The books they referenced seemed permanent. Why worry about preservation when the works were readily available? But availability proved temporary, and their casual references became invaluable evidence. Islamic scholars during the 8th through 11th centuries performed more deliberate preservation. They collected Greek scientific and philosophical works systematically, translated them into Arabic, studied them, built upon them. Ptolemy's Almagest survived primarily through Arabic transmission. The original Greek was lost for centuries. When European scholars wanted to study Ptolemaic astronomy, they translated it from Arabic back to Latin. Many of Aristotle's works followed the same path. Lost in Europe, preserved in Baghdad, recovered centuries later through translation from Arabic. The preservation was selective but aggressive. Islamic scholars valued scientific and philosophical knowledge. They sought out texts, paid for translations, supported scholars working with Greek sources. Meanwhile, in European monasteries, different selection pressures operated. Religious texts received priority. Classical works deemed morally improving were copied. Scientific treatises that challenged church teaching were often ignored. Knowledge survived through the interests of whoever happened to be copying texts. A scholar's curiosity, a translator's project, a teacher's curriculum, a monastery's mission. Accidental preservation, arbitrary selection, individual choices, creating patterns that shaped what humanity would know about its past. The scholars who saved fragments rarely knew they were saving anything. They were just working with the materials available, following their interests, doing their jobs. The fact that we remember them at all proves how much has been forgotten. Plutarch's parallel lives survived the centuries remarkably intact. We have most of it. Biographies of famous Greeks and Romans, arranged in pairs for comparison, entertaining, morally instructive, perfect for teaching students. That last quality saved it. School teachers assigned it for centuries. Students copied it to practice writing. Monasteries kept copies for educational purposes. Each generation needed new copies for new students, ensuring continuous transmission. Meanwhile, advanced scientific treatises disappeared, not because they were less important, not because they were poorly written, but because they weren't useful for teaching basic students, required specialized knowledge to copy accurately, and didn't serve the educational or religious missions of the institutions doing the copying. The ancient books you can read today survived not because they were the best, but because they happened to be useful to medieval students, religiously acceptable to monks, or entertaining enough that people kept copying them. Survival followed patterns. Educational texts survived better than research texts. Works compatible with Christian teaching survived better than those challenging it. Poetry and drama survived better than technical manuals. Shorter works survived better than longer ones. Copying costs increased with length. Material factors mattered enormously. Papyrus deteriorated. Scrolls became brittle, tore, rotted in damp conditions. The only way to preserve them was constant recopying. That required resources, skilled labor, and most crucially, someone deciding the work was worth the effort. The transition from scroll to codex, from rolled papyrus to bound pages, created a massive selection event. Someone had to decide what got copied into the new format, what seemed important enough to invest in, what could be left behind. Parchment, which replaced papyrus, was expensive, made from animal skins. A large book might require an entire flock's worth of material. This created pressure to reuse, scrape off old texts, write new ones on the clean surface. What got erased? Works considered obsolete, heretical, or simply less valuable than what was being written over them. Each major historical transition became a selection event. Greek to Latin as the scholarly language, only works deemed worthy of translation survived that shift. Hand copying to printing, early printers chose what to print based on marketability. Monasteries in medieval Europe preserved what fit their mission. Religious texts, obviously, Latin classics that could teach moral lessons or provide good Latin examples, saints' lives, theological arguments, scientific works in Greek that required mathematical knowledge and challenged religious cosmology, often not copied, left to decay, lost. But the Islamic Golden Age operated under different selection pressures. Scholars in Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba aggressively collected scientific and philosophical works. They valued empirical knowledge, mathematical sophistication, astronomical observation. They preserved what Christian Europe was letting disappear. created a parallel transmission stream, different priorities yielding different survivals. This means our knowledge of the ancient world is shaped by medieval selection pressures. We know what medieval monks and Islamic scholars chose to preserve. Everything else is filtered through their decisions, their values, their interests. The ancient world we can study isn't the complete ancient world. It's the version that happened to align with medieval preservation priorities. Arbitrary selection, accident of history, individual decisions accumulating into patterns that shaped what humanity would remember about itself. Ancient Alexandria is submerged. Parts of it, anyway. Earthquakes and subsidence over centuries sent portions of the ancient city into the Mediterranean. The royal quarter, likely location of the library, is underwater. Divers explore the ruins. Robot cameras navigate between fallen columns. Underwater archaeologists map structures, catalogue artifacts, document what remains. It's difficult work. Visibility is limited. 2,000 years of sediment covers everything. Modern Alexandria sits on top of ancient Alexandria, making excavation complicated. And even when structures are found, identifying them is challenging. Is this foundation from the museum, from the library, from some other royal building? Without inscriptions, without distinctive features, it's guesswork. But the search continues. Today, robots with cameras explore underwater ruins of ancient Alexandria. AI analyzes ancient texts for hidden patterns, and particle accelerators read scrolls too damaged to unroll. We're still searching for the library's ghosts. Satellite imaging reveals buried structures invisible at ground level, patterns in vegetation, soil composition, subtle depressions. Ground-penetrating radar maps what lies beneath modern streets without digging. Digital Humanities projects approach the problem differently. Computer analysis of surviving texts, looking for patterns that might reveal information about lost sources. AI trained to predict what lost works might have contained based on references and fragments. Databases catalog every known reference to lost works, every quotation, every mention, creating comprehensive maps of what once existed and where evidence of it survives. Modern technology creates new possibilities for reading damaged materials. Multispectral imaging reveals erased text on palimpsests. X-ray tomography reads carbonized scrolls without unrolling them. Particle accelerators analyze ink composition to distinguish it from papyrus. The Herculaneum papyri are gradually being decoded. Scrolls that looked like charcoal yielding philosophical treatises when scanned with advanced imaging. Each successful reading is a minor miracle. Lost comedies by Menander have been recovered from papyrus fragments. The Archimedes palimpsest revealed mathematical works through imaging technology. Each discovery makes headlines in academic journals, but each discovery also emphasizes the scale of loss. For every fragment recovered, 1,000 remain lost. For every scroll successfully read, hundreds were destroyed before modern technology could attempt reading them. For every reference catalogued, dozens of works are so completely lost that no reference survives. The successes are real. The technology is impressive. The dedication of scholars and scientists searching for lost knowledge is admirable. Yet the gap between what's been recovered and what was lost is vast, unbridgeable. Still, the search continues. Because recovering even fragments matters. Because understanding what was lost helps us value what survives. Because the hunt itself honors the library's original mission. Alexandria tried to gather all human knowledge in one place. We're still trying to recover what they gathered. Still searching for echoes of that great collection. The library is gone. But the search for what it contained continues into the present, will continue into the future. Some ghosts. We never stop hunting. History doesn't have rewind buttons. We can't test alternative timelines. Can't know with certainty what would have happened if different choices had been made, different accidents avoided, different priorities maintained. But sometimes, it's worth imagining. Europe, in the early medieval period, lost the Greek language almost entirely. Outside Byzantium, virtually no one could read the texts that had shaped classical civilization. Scientific inquiry largely stopped. Engineering regressed. Medical knowledge contracted to a fraction of what ancient physicians had known. This wasn't inevitable. It was the result of specific historical circumstances. Among them, the loss of the accumulated knowledge that Alexandria had gathered. What if the Dark Ages weren't inevitable, but were instead the direct result of one library's destruction? What if humanity spent 1,000 years relearning what it already knew? Consider medical knowledge. The plague killed somewhere between 75 and 200 million people across multiple outbreaks. Medieval physicians had no framework for understanding contagious disease, no protocols for quarantine, no systematic approach to treatment. Ancient physicians had understood quarantine, had recognized that disease spread person to person, had developed protocols that, while not perfect, were based on observation rather than superstition. If those medical texts had survived and spread, could the death toll have been reduced? Not eliminated, that would require germ theory and antibiotics, but reduced? Possibly significantly. Engineering knowledge offers another scenario. Roman aqueducts, roads, and buildings survived for centuries, but the knowledge to build new ones was lost. Medieval Europe couldn't match Roman concrete, couldn't replicate their construction techniques. If that engineering knowledge had been preserved, could infrastructure have been maintained? Could cities have remained larger, healthier, more connected? Astronomical knowledge presents perhaps the most intriguing alternative. Aristarchus proposed a heliocentric model in the 3rd century before the Common Era. His full work is lost. We know about it only through brief references. If his complete argument had survived, would the Copernican revolution have happened 1,000 years earlier? Would observational astronomy have continued advancing rather than regressing into astrology? Democritus developed an atomic theory, matter composed of tiny indivisible particles. The details of his reasoning are lost. If the complete theory had survived, would modern physics have developed faster? We can't know. But we can observe what happened where knowledge was preserved. The Byzantine Empire maintained some classical learning. Islamic scholars preserved and built upon Greek science and philosophy. Both cultures experienced less dramatic knowledge regression than Western Europe. Preservation made a difference. Different trajectories, different timelines. The concept of lost time becomes relevant here. How many centuries were spent rediscovering what had once been known? Heliocentrism, atomic theory, evidence-based medicine, engineering principles. Not all knowledge had to be rediscovered from scratch. Some survived through Byzantine and Islamic transmission. Some was partially preserved in degraded forms. But enormous effort went into relearning, rebuilding, recovering what had been lost. That effort could have gone toward advancing instead of recovering, building on ancient foundations rather than reconstructing them. This isn't claiming the library's survival would have created utopia. Human nature doesn't change. Political conflicts, religious divisions, economic pressures, all would have continued affecting knowledge, preservation, and transmission. But trajectories might have been different. The depth of regression might have been shallower. The duration of the recovery period might have been shorter. Some suffering might have been prevented. Some discoveries might have come sooner. Some knowledge might never have been lost at all. We'll never know what was possible, only what actually happened. And what happened included a dark age that might not have been quite so dark. Right now, as you listen to this, knowledge is disappearing. Every 14 days, a language dies. With it goes unique ways of describing the world, concepts that don't exist in other languages, stories that carry ecological knowledge, navigational techniques, medicinal practices developed over generations. Every year, specialized skills become extinct. Master craftspeople retire without apprentices. Traditional techniques are replaced by industrial processes. The knowledge of how to do something, the tacit understanding that can't be fully captured in instructions, vanishes when the last practitioner dies. Every moment, digital data is being lost. File formats become obsolete. Storage media degrades. Websites disappear. The internet feels permanent, but it's constantly forgetting. Right now, knowledge is disappearing. Languages die. Skills are forgotten. Data formats become unreadable. The Library of Alexandria's destruction isn't past, it's continuous. The library's loss demonstrates something we keep forgetting. Knowledge isn't self-preserving. It requires constant, active effort to maintain. Physical destruction is obvious. Fires, floods, wars. But most knowledge loss is quieter. Neglect claims more than catastrophe. Papyrus scrolls not recopied before they deteriorate. Books not digitized before they crumble. Languages not documented before their last speakers die. Selection kills silently. Choosing what to preserve means choosing what to let go, and those choices are made based on current values, current priorities, current predictions about future usefulness. Sometimes we're wrong about what will matter. Different types of knowledge are vulnerable in different ways. Practical knowledge, how to forge Damascus steel, How to create Roman concrete can be lost when practitioners die without teaching successors. Theoretical knowledge requires texts to survive, and readers who understand them. Tacit knowledge is especially fragile. The understanding that comes from years of practice, the intuition that can't be fully articulated, the know-how that exists in hands and muscles and practiced judgment. You can't write it down completely, can't preserve it in books. It requires living transmission. Master to apprentice, generation to generation. When the chain breaks, it's gone. Digital technology seemed to solve preservation problems. Copying is effortless, storage is cheap, distribution is global and instant. But digital creates new vulnerabilities. Formats become obsolete faster than physical materials decay. Software requires specific hardware. Files require specific software. The chain of dependencies creates countless breaking points. We have texts from 3,000 years ago. We have digital files from 20 years ago that are already unreadable. Indigenous communities worldwide are experiencing massive knowledge loss. Traditional ecological understanding, which plants are edible, which are medicinal, how ecosystems function, when to plant and harvest disappearing, as elders die and young people move to cities. Craft traditions ending as industrial production replaces handwork. Specialized repair skills vanishing as products become disposable. Historical memory fading as oral traditions give way to written ones, then written ones give way to digital ones that may or may not persist. Alexandria's loss isn't just historical tragedy. It's ongoing reality. It's happening now, in different forms, at different scales, for different reasons. Knowledge is always at risk. Preservation requires deliberate choice and sustained effort, or everything fragile eventually breaks. The Ptolemies wanted to collect everything knowable, every book, every scroll, every text, from every culture, in every language that could be found and translated. It was an audacious goal, probably impossible even then, certainly unsustainable in the long term, but what an ambition. The Library of Alexandria was built on a wild idea, that everything knowable should be known, and once known, preserved forever. We've never quite decided if that was wisdom or hubris. Behind that ambition lay certain beliefs. That knowledge has intrinsic value. That understanding is worth pursuing for its own sake, not just for practical application. That future generations have a right to inherit human intellectual achievements. Different cultures have approached preservation differently. Oral traditions kept knowledge alive through memorization and performance. Stories, songs, genealogies, passed down with remarkable accuracy across generations. No physical storage required. The human mind became the archive. But oral transmission is vulnerable. When the chain breaks, everything breaks. Written traditions created permanent records. Physical objects carrying information independent of any individual's memory. But writing requires maintenance. Materials decay. Languages change. Scripts become unreadable. Institutions like libraries and schools attempted systematic preservation. Dedicated resources, specialized labor, social commitment to maintaining knowledge across generations. But institutions are vulnerable too, to political change, economic pressure, cultural transformation, war. Preservation is always selective. We can't save everything. Resources are limited. Storage has costs. Someone must choose what matters enough to preserve. The tension is fundamental. Try to preserve everything, and you're overwhelmed by information. Most of it will be mundane, redundant, or of limited value. Curate selectively, and you risk losing what seems unimportant now but might be crucial later. How do you know what future generations will need? Modern debates about digital preservation echo ancient dilemmas. Should we archive the entire internet, every social media post, every email, every document ever created digitally? The storage is theoretically possible, but the curation would be impossible, and uncurated archives are nearly useless. Finding anything in undifferentiated chaos is harder than finding it in organized scarcity. Alexandria chose aggressive acquisition and comprehensive collection. They pursued completeness. They valued breadth. They wanted everything. It required enormous resources, royal patronage, dedicated staff, continuous copying and maintenance. When that support failed, so did the collection. But knowledge isn't just information. It's understanding. Not just facts but frameworks for thinking. Not just data, but the contexts that make data meaningful. The library wasn't storing isolated facts. It was preserving entire intellectual traditions, different approaches to problems, alternative ways of understanding the world. competing theories that expanded the space of possibilities. When those traditions were lost, the diversity of human thought contracted. Certain approaches disappeared. Certain questions stopped being asked. The range of what seemed thinkable narrowed. Preservation is fundamentally a moral choice, a statement about what we value, what we believe we owe to the future, whether we think knowledge belongs to all humanity or just to those currently alive. Every preserved text is a gift to the future. Every lost text is a theft from it. We choose, through action or neglect, what we pass forward, what future generations will inherit or mourn. Alexandria tried to choose everything. The choice proved unsustainable, but maybe the ambition itself was worth something. The Library of Alexandria has become more than history. It's become symbol, metaphor, mirror. For some, it represents human ambition at its finest, the hunger to know everything, the dedication to preserve and share knowledge, the belief that understanding matters more than power or wealth. For others, it represents tragedy, the irreplaceable lost forever, human achievement destroyed by human folly, the fragility of everything we build. For still others, it's warning, about the impermanence of institutions, the fragility of civilization, the consequences of political instability and cultural conflict. Every generation retells the library's story differently, seeing in its loss what they most fear losing themselves. What does that say about us? Enlightenment writers saw religious intolerance destroying reason. They made the library's destruction a parable about the conflict between faith and science, emotion and logic, darkness and light. Cold War writers saw totalitarianism destroying freedom. The library became a symbol of open inquiry crushed by authoritarian control, intellectual diversity eliminated by ideological conformity. Modern writers see warning about data loss and cultural preservation. The library's destruction parallels digital information loss, indigenous knowledge disappearing, climate change threatening physical archives. Each generation projects its own anxieties onto ancient events, uses Alexandria as a way to talk about contemporary concerns. The story resonates because it's comprehensible. We understand what a library is. We can imagine the loss. It's not abstract. The scale is enormous but graspable. Hundreds of thousands of scrolls, centuries of knowledge, the entire intellectual heritage of multiple civilizations. We can't fully comprehend what was lost, but we can feel its weight, and it was preventable. That might be the most painful part. It didn't have to happen. Different choices, different priorities, different accidents could have preserved what was lost. The library's story functions as cautionary tale, about impermanence, about fragility, about the importance of redundancy. Don't keep all knowledge in one place, no matter how secure it seems. About the consequences of political instability. When governments fail, when economies collapse, when wars rage, cultural institutions suffer. Knowledge preservation requires stability and resources. About human nature, our capacity for both preservation and destruction, our tendency to destroy what we don't understand or what threatens us, our ability to build magnificent institutions and then neglect them to death. The story teaches humility. All our knowledge, all our achievements, all our certainties about what's permanent, all of it could vanish, is vanishing, will continue to vanish, unless actively protected. We are all inheritors of what survived, beneficiaries of the choices made by people who preserved texts when they could have let them decay, who translated works into new languages when the original readers were gone, who maintained traditions when maintaining them was difficult and unrewarding. We're also all mourners of what was lost. Whether we know it or not, we've been impoverished by the absence of knowledge that once existed, and we're all decision makers about what comes next, what we preserve, what we neglect, what future generations will inherit or mourn. The Library of Alexandria fell. The question is what we'll do with what remains. Here's a strange fact. More people know about the Library of Alexandria now than knew about it during most of its existence. When it functioned, it was a specialized institution serving a small scholarly community. Important, certainly. Impressive, absolutely. But most people living in the ancient Mediterranean world never saw it, never used it, probably never thought about it much. Now, destroyed for over 1,500 years, it's everywhere, in novels and films, video games and documentaries, university lectures and internet discussions. The library appears constantly in contemporary culture, more present in its absence than it ever was in its existence. The Library of Alexandria is more powerful now, destroyed, than it ever was when it stood. Sometimes absence shapes the world more than presence ever could. Destroyed things capture imagination differently than preserved ones. The Parthenon still stands, damaged but real, and we admire it. But we don't dream about what the Parthenon might have been the way we dream about Alexandria. Loss creates longing. Mystery invites speculation. Absence becomes a blank space we can fill with imagination. Fantasy novels use the library as a symbol of lost knowledge waiting to be rediscovered. Science fiction references it as a warning about civilization collapse. Philosophers invoke it when discussing the fragility of culture. Activists cite it when arguing for preservation funding. It appears in unexpected contexts. The internet gets called the New Library of Alexandria, an attempt to collect all information in one accessible place. Digital preservation projects explicitly reference Alexandria's ambition and warning. The Internet Archive, founded by Brewster Carley, pursues Alexandria's goal: universal access to all knowledge. Scanning books, archiving web pages, preserving software. The Wayback Machine lets you see websites as they existed years ago, preventing digital knowledge from vanishing the way ancient scrolls did. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault, buried in Arctic permafrost, protects genetic diversity against catastrophe. It's called the Doomsday Vault, but it's really an attempt to prevent agricultural knowledge loss, the same impulse that drove Alexandria to collect farming manuals and botanical texts. The Long Now Foundation works on a 10,000-year library, knowledge designed to survive across timescales that dwarf human institutions. They're thinking about preservation the way Alexandria did, but with even longer horizons. Google Books scanning millions of volumes. Wikipedia offering free encyclopedic knowledge. Open access movements making research available without paywalls. Different approaches, different technologies, but all echoing Alexandria's fundamental commitment. Knowledge should be gathered, preserved, shared. The library's destruction created a question that drives modern preservation. What will future generations wish we had saved? That question influences contemporary choices. Climate scientists archive atmospheric data. Linguists record dying languages. Anthropologists document traditional practices. Biologists catalogue species before potential extinction. All of them working against time, trying to preserve what might otherwise be lost. The library failed to preserve everything, but its failure taught us something valuable. What's not deliberately preserved will probably be lost. The irony is profound. As a functioning institution, the library was important but local. A single building in one city, limited access, resources concentrated in one vulnerable location. As a destroyed institution, it became universal, a symbol everyone can access, an idea that spreads across cultures and centuries, a warning and inspiration that touches preservation work worldwide. The building is gone. The collection is scattered or lost. The institution ceased functioning 16 centuries ago, but the dream it represented, comprehensive knowledge, carefully preserved, freely shared, that dream is more alive now than ever. The library's greatest influence may be as an absent ideal rather than as a physical place, an impossible goal that nonetheless inspires attempts, a vision of what knowledge preservation could be, even if it can never be fully realized. Sometimes what's lost matters more than what remains. Brewster Carley has a simple goal: preserve everything. Every website that ever existed, every book that's fallen out of copyright, every recording, every film, every piece of software before it becomes obsolete. Universal access to all knowledge. He calls his project the Internet Archive, but he could have called it the Library of Alexandria. The Wayback Machine has archived over 700 billion web pages. When websites disappear, and they disappear constantly, the archive preserves what they were. Millions of books scanned and made available, audio collections, video collections, software preservation so future generations can run ancient programs. It's the most ambitious knowledge preservation project in human history, and it faces challenges Alexandria would recognize. Copyright battles over book scanning, publishers suing to prevent digitization, authors claiming their work shouldn't be archived without permission. The legal framework designed for physical books struggling to accommodate digital preservation. Funding sustainability. The archive runs on donations and grants. No royal patron guaranteeing resources. No state treasury backing the mission. just the precarious financing that non-profit organizations everywhere face. Political pressure. Groups demanding certain materials be removed. Governments requesting access to data. The tension between preservation and control playing out in contemporary contexts. We're building new Alexandrias every day. Servers backing up the internet, vaults storing seeds, satellites recording Earth's changes. We're trying again, with better backup plans. Google Books, though commercial rather than purely educational, has scanned over 40 million books. JSTOR archives, academic journals. Project Gutenberg relies on volunteers to digitize public domain texts, each project preserving different pieces of human knowledge. Language preservation efforts record dying languages. Speakers working with linguists to document grammar, vocabulary, stories before the last fluent speakers die. Digital audio making preservation more reliable than written descriptions alone. Biodiversity databases catalog species, genetic sequences, distribution patterns, behavior observations. Trying to document Earth's biological diversity before species go extinct and take their genetic information with them. Physical preservation continues too. The Svalbard Seed Vault holds over 1 million seed samples, backup copies in case regional seed banks fail, insurance against agricultural catastrophe. National libraries around the world collect their country's publications. Specialized archives preserve everything from film to traditional crafts. Museums document material culture. Universities maintain research collections. But here's the crucial difference from Alexandria. Modern preservation is distributed. No single institution holds everything. Multiple institutions hold redundant copies. The Internet Archive mirrors its data across multiple locations. Seed banks exist in dozens of countries. Digital preservation includes backups in different geographic locations, different political jurisdictions, different institutional frameworks. This distribution reduces vulnerability. Fire can't destroy all copies. Political upheaval in one country doesn't eliminate access everywhere. Single catastrophic events can't erase knowledge completely. But distribution creates new challenges. Coordination between institutions, ensuring access despite geographic spread, maintaining compatible formats so preserved materials remain usable. And the fundamental questions persist. Should private companies control knowledge archives? Google Books is valuable, but Google is a corporation with profit motives. Should governments fund preservation without controlling content? History shows governments can be censorious. How do we balance open access against creator rights? Authors deserve compensation, but future generations deserve access to cultural heritage. The debates parallel ancient questions in modern contexts. Who owns knowledge? Who controls access? What deserves preservation? Who decides? We're living through humanity's most ambitious preservation attempt ever. Tools Alexandria's librarians couldn't imagine. Scale beyond their wildest dreams. But facing fundamentally similar challenges, the new Alexandrias are digital and distributed, backed up and redundant, more resilient than the original, but still vulnerable, still dependent on sustained commitment, still requiring choices about what to save and what to let go, still trying to preserve everything, knowing we'll inevitably fail, but trying anyway. 23 centuries separate us from Alexandria. The technology has changed beyond recognition. The political context is completely different. The scale of knowledge is vastly larger. But the fundamental questions remain the same. What should we save? Who decides? Who pays? How do we protect knowledge from those who fear or oppose it? 23 centuries separate us from Alexandria, but we face the same questions. What should we save? Who decides? Who pays? How do we protect knowledge from those who fear or oppose it? The library's first lesson: knowledge is not self-preserving. Digital data feels permanent. It's not. File formats become obsolete. Storage media degrades. Websites disappear. Without active maintenance, migration to new formats, refreshing of storage media, sustained institutional support, digital information vanishes as completely as papyrus scrolls left uncopied. Alexandria's decline began with reduced support. Familiar pattern. Modern libraries face budget cuts. Archives lose funding. Research institutions compete for scarce resources. When economic pressure increases, knowledge preservation often loses to more immediate priorities. The lesson about centralization. Alexandria's concentration created vulnerability. One location, one collection, one catastrophic event could destroy everything. Modern distributed systems, Cloud storage, multiple backup sites, international collaboration provide better protection, but distribution creates coordination challenges. Who maintains the master catalogue? How do institutions share resources? Who has authority when priorities conflict? The lesson about selection and bias. What we preserve shapes what future generations know. Alexandria tried to collect everything, but still made choices. Greek texts over barbarian ones. Written materials over oral traditions. Works considered important over works considered trivial. Modern preservation faces identical pressures. Whose stories get archived? Major media outlets or community blogs? English language content or minority languages? Professional publications or amateur creation? Digital storage is cheap, but not infinite. Curation requires judgment, and judgment reflects bias. The bias of our time will shape what future generations know about us, just as ancient biases shaped what we know about them. The lesson about political and cultural stability. Knowledge institutions require supportive environments. When governments collapse, when economies crash, when wars rage, archives burn. Not always deliberately. Sometimes they're just collateral damage in larger conflicts. Sometimes they lose funding because resources go to more urgent needs. Modern examples abound. Iraqi National Archives damaged during invasion. Syrian cultural sites destroyed in civil war. Research funding cut during economic downturns. Political interference in academic institutions. Stability isn't guaranteed. The institutions preserving knowledge today depend on political will and economic capacity that could change. The lesson about access. Preservation isn't enough. Knowledge must be accessible and comprehensible. Alexandria translated texts, created catalogues, made knowledge findable and usable. Modern efforts require similar work. Digitization without metadata is nearly useless. Archives without finding aids are inaccessible. Preservation without user-friendly interfaces limits who can benefit. And there's the lesson about time. Preservation requires multi-generational commitment. Alexandria functioned for centuries through sustained support. When that support ended, so did the institution. Modern preservation projects need similar longevity. The Internet Archive needs to last not just years but centuries. Seed vaults need maintenance across generations. Digital formats need migration as technology evolves. Short-term thinking kills long-term preservation. Quarterly profit focus doesn't support century-scale projects. Political cycles measured in years can't sustain commitments measured in decades. Technology changes, contexts shift, but the underlying challenges persist. Resources, selection, access, sustainability, political support, cultural commitment. We face the same questions Alexandria faced. Our answers may differ. Our tools are certainly different. But the fundamental challenge, preserving human knowledge across time, despite all the forces working against it, that remains unchanged. When exactly was the library destroyed? We don't know. Different sources give different dates. 48 BCE, 272 CE, 391 CE, 642 CE. Each answer has evidence. Each has problems. The truth might be, gradually, across centuries, rather than any single date. How much was actually lost? Estimates range wildly. Some ancient sources claim 400,000 scrolls, others say 700,000. Modern scholars debate whether these numbers are accurate, exaggerated, or counting works versus copies. We don't know. We'll never know. What exactly was in the collection? We know some titles. We have catalogues from scholars who worked there. But comprehensive catalogues, if they ever existed, are lost. The library's contents are reconstructed from fragments, references, educated guesses. We know enough to understand the scale, but not enough to create a complete inventory. Which famous texts were actually there? Popular accounts attribute many lost works to Alexandria. Some attributions are solid, others are speculation. Did they have the complete works of Sappho? Probably, but we can't be certain. Did they have texts from India and China? Possibly, but evidence is thin. These uncertainties are themselves significant. They show how completely the library vanished. It didn't just lose its collection. It lost certain knowledge of what the collection contained, lost records of its own holdings, lost even the clear facts of its own destruction. We'll probably never know exactly what burned, when it burned, or who burned it. Perhaps that's fitting for a library dedicated to gathering all knowable things, that its own story remains partially unknowable. The mysteries persist because ancient sources contradict each other, because archaeology of ancient Alexandria is difficult, the modern city built on top, parts submerged underwater, political complications affecting excavation, because time has obscured evidence. Each passing century makes certainty less likely. Different scholars continue debating. New evidence occasionally emerges. An underwater discovery, a papyrus fragment, a reanalysis of ancient texts. But rarely does new evidence provide definitive answers. Usually, it just complicates the existing questions. Perhaps the mysteries are appropriate. The library represents the unknowable, the lost, the forgotten. Having definitive answers would make it less powerful as a symbol, less open to interpretation, less available as a mirror for each generation's concerns. Not knowing everything about the library mirrors the larger condition of historical knowledge. We know fragments, infer from incomplete evidence, construct narratives from scattered data, acknowledge uncertainty while trying to understand what we can. The library's mysteries inspire continued investigation. Scholars still searching underwater ruins, still analyzing papyri, still debating interpretations of ancient sources, still hoping to find something definitive. The search itself honors the library's spirit, the commitment to investigation, the refusal to accept ignorance as inevitable, the drive to preserve and understand whatever can be known. We may never recover what was lost, but we can keep searching, keep questioning, keep trying to understand. The Library of Alexandria asked, "What can we know?" Its own destruction became a question we're still trying to answer. And perhaps that's its final lesson. Some questions remain open, some mysteries persist, and the appropriate response isn't to abandon inquiry but to continue searching, knowing we may never find complete answers. There's a silence in human history where the Library of Alexandria used to be. We began with that idea, thousands of words ago. The absence, the gap, the lost knowledge we can barely imagine. But now, at the end of this journey, we can add something else. There's also an echo. Every lost medical treatment exists now as absence, but absence that shapes our understanding of how fragile knowledge is. Every vanished play reminds us that survival is miracle, not certainty. Every forgotten technology teaches us that progress isn't linear. The echo changes how we value what remains. Every ancient text that survived is precious. Every fragment is treasure. Every piece of recovered knowledge is a small victory against forgetting. The library's story is ultimately about the relationship between civilization and memory. Civilizations are memory systems. Cultures are collective remembering. When memory breaks down, civilization becomes fragile. We create knowledge constantly, new discoveries, new art, new understanding. But creation is only half the equation. Preservation requires deliberate effort, resources, commitment, choices about what matters enough to save. We're generating more knowledge now than ever before, publishing more, recording more, documenting more, but we're also potentially losing more than ever. Formats changing, languages dying, specialized knowledge disappearing with practitioners who never found apprentices. The question we started with, what if everything we know is just a fragment of what once was? Now we can add, and what does that mean for what we're creating now? What will future generations wish we had preserved? What are we letting slip away while we assume someone else is saving it? The Library of Alexandria reminds us that knowledge is precious and fragile, that preservation is active choice, not automatic process, that everything we know could be lost if we don't care for it. The library is gone. The building is ruins, or underwater, or buried beneath modern construction. The collection is scattered fragments or complete absence. The institution ceased functioning 16 centuries ago, but its ambition continues. To gather, preserve, and share all human knowledge. That ambition lives in every library, every archive, every museum, every database, every attempt to remember rather than forget. It lives in the person digitizing old newspapers so they won't be lost when the paper crumbles, in the linguist recording a dying language, in the researcher archiving climate data, in the librarian fighting budget cuts, in the programmer maintaining old software so future generations can access it. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but every time someone preserves a story, documents a tradition, digitizes a manuscript, or simply remembers what might otherwise be forgotten, they rebuild it, piece by piece, in the only place it can exist now, in our collective commitment to remember. The silence remains. The gap in human knowledge can never be completely filled. What was lost is lost. but the echo endures. The memory of what was attempted, the recognition of what was lost, the commitment to try again, to preserve better, to remember longer. The Library of Alexandria is gone. The work continues,